Good morning, Chairman.
Good morning. I'll make it 10 o'clock, so welcome to this formal meeting of the Public Protection and Community Scrutiny Committee. My name is Councillor Nigel Pepper, and I'm the Chairman of this committee. Councillor Adam Stokes, Vice Chairman of this committee, is also in attendance. The audio-visual feed of this formal public meeting is being broadcast via the County Council's website. I would like to welcome the members of the press and public who are listening to this online. I would like to begin with a health and safety announcement. There is no fire drill planned this morning. In the event of the fire alarm sounding, we'll need to leave the council chamber through the rear doors and leave the building through the reception in the front car park. We will then need to wait in the car park for further instructions. Can I ask everyone to ensure their mobiles, laptops and iPads are on silent, please? Before we move on further with the main business of this meeting, can I remind you that if you wish to ask a question during the course of the meeting, can you please raise your hand? Can I also remind members of the committee to switch on their microphones when invited to speak, and to speak close to the microphone, and switch their microphone off after they've made their contributions. I'd like to also welcome officers presenting today who are participating live via Microsoft Teams. Can I ask that you introduce yourselves at the beginning of your item or when you make a contribution? To ask questions or contribute during the meeting, please raise your hand virtually or type "speak" in the chat function. When invited to speak, you should unmute your microphones and switch on your video. When you're not participating in the meeting, please make sure you have muted your microphone and switched your video off. Requests to speak will be collated by the Vice Chairman. We'll now move to the formal agenda. Agenda item 1, apologies for absence, replacement councillors. Trina, I believe you're going to report on that.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, we've received apologies from Councillor M. Clark and Councillor Mrs. Elizabeth Sneath.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Item 2, declarations of councillors' interests. Do any members wish to declare any interest which may not have been declared on their declaration of pecuniary interest forms? No. Okay, thank you. Item 3, minutes of the previous meeting held on the Public Protection and Community Scrutiny Committee held on the 16th of March. I'll just go through those briefly, starting on page 7, page 8, 9, 10, 11 and finally page 12. I think I'm right in saying, though, that only myself and Councillor Stokes are the only ones here who's at that committee meeting, so I'll propose and I'd think you'd second. Just need to go through a formal vote there, so I'd expect everyone else to abstain, but anyone not got any objections to that? Anyone for? Nobody can be against, so anyone abstain? Yeah, so I'd expect to see everyone else abstaining, quite honestly. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so item 4, announcements by the Chairman, Executive Councillors and Lead Officers. In line with the communication circulated yesterday, item 8 of this agenda, which was the Technical Response Unit refresh, will not be considered in today's meeting. It will come back in the next meeting in September. This is because of the delay in publishing the report, which would hinder members' ability to scrutinise its contents. Nevertheless, there is still a long agenda to go through this morning, with 2 pre-decision items. I'd therefore like to ask officers to summarise the key points of their reports and what is required by the committee in regard to members of this committee, to stress the importance of concise questions and contributions. I'd also like to note the attendance of Councillor Lindsay Corey, to my right, Councillor Colin Matthews and Councillor Alexander Morn. I believe Councillor Sue Woolley is in the meeting via Teams. Executive Councillor announcements. Are there any announcements from Executive Council? I'll turn to Councillor Corey first.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. No, I have no special announcements. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Woolley, if you can hear us, any comments, please?
Thank you, Chairman. No, I have no special announcements.
Okay, thank you very much. And Councillor Danny McNally, is he in attendance? It's in. Sorry? No, Councillor Danny McNally. Councillor McNally, I should have said. Yeah, no problem, yeah. I believe there's, he might have been in attendance, but seems not. Okay, thank you. We'll move on then to item 5, which is the service level performance reporting against the performance framework 2020 to 2021, quarter 4. This item is on pages 13 to 52 of the agenda pack and sets out the quarter 4 performance for community safety, fire safety, libraries and heritage, road safety, trading standards and volunteering. The report will be presented by Diane Colson, Assistant Director, Public Protection, also Nicole Hilton, Assistant Director, Communities, Lee Surdyfield, Assistant Director, Corporate, Mark Baxter, Chief Fire Officer, and Stephen Batchelor, Lincolnshire Road Safety Partnership Senior Manager, are all attending today via Teams. So hopefully you can hear us, Diane, so it's over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, everybody. So if I just touch on the domestic abuse reporting. So you'll see on page 15 the figures in relation to the numbers of victims of domestic abuse receiving support. The commentary, obviously, it shows that the target hasn't been achieved, but the commentary hopefully explains that to you in that the target was based on the forecast from 2019 and 20. And we have subsequently revised the reported figures to only include those adults and children that are referred in for support that actually receive support. So where those come in and don't actually engage with services and receive any form of support, we haven't counted those so that the figures are showing more accurately on who's receiving support from the services that we commission. And as you'll see from the commentary, that would actually, those revised figures would actually put us within the range of the target. So obviously we continue to support victims of domestic abuse across Lincolnshire, and obviously they're referred in by a multitude of different agencies. So we continue to do that. And then the other page, on page 17, reflects those victims of domestic abuse who are considered to be at the highest risk of serious injury or death, and those are the cases that get reported through into the multi-agency risk assessment conference, which pulls together a number of different agencies to understand and share information around the victims in those cases with a view to safeguarding long term. And as you'll see from the data there, that we continue to see referrals going in, and a number of those, 180 of those which are not included within here, are actually repeat cases. So the figures of victims receiving support through the barrack process is actually greater than reflected there. So I'll pause there and just see if there's any questions.
Okay, thank you. Have we got any questions for Diane? Councillor Danny.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question. It's probably a question, yes. It's when we talk about the domestic abuse, and I experienced a few weeks ago a very sad domestic abuse. Apparently, it was happening in the street. And a member of the public, a lady, she was in distress, and she called the police because a gentleman was dragging his girlfriend outside in the street from her clothes and beating her up. My question and my shock is when the police were called, they came, they went to the house, I was there standing, and then the gentleman, the PC, came out and he said there is nothing we can do because the lady doesn't want to press charges. Now, that's one issue, I will come back to it. The second issue is the lady, when she was in distress and she was crying when she called the police because she was really shocked, and I tried to comfort her. The PC didn't ask her if she want to go further because, as we can call it, is a public disorder. So the police at that situation, they should issue a public disorder basically, because it's likely by law and legislation, it's likely to cause harm or distress to the members of the public. My question, can we do anything with the police when a certain, situation arises to press the charges against the offenders as a public disorder? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Diane. That's not necessarily in our report as such, but are you able to answer that question, please?
Thank you, Councillor, for the question. So, in essence, we don't always need a victim to support a prosecution for the police to prosecute. Domestic abuse cases are complex by their very nature. Victims are complex due to circumstances that they find themselves in, not through their own fault, but it can be difficult for them to, once the police arrive, want to support a prosecution. However, that said, the police can still investigate and can still, in certain circumstances where there is evidence, prosecute in terms of domestic abuse. And the police are encouraged to do that because of the harm and the difficulties that victims face in coming forward and actually supporting prosecution. There are obviously public order offences that the police can consider and should consider in these cases, particularly if it is out in the street and there is that issue, because clearly we don't need a victim to support that. So without knowing the details of that particular individual case, if there are concerns then and how that was handled, then I would suggest that contact is made with Lincolnshire Police to try and understand what went on there, and so that they can learn some lessons from that and make sure that doesn't happen in the future.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Diane. Is there any further questions for Diane? Councillor Mrs. Clark.
Thank you, Diane. I was looking for a bit more detail on the report about the domestic abuse. I think people do tend to think about domestic abuse towards women, but I would like to see a bit more information about domestic abuse towards men, which largely goes unreported, and I was wondering if there was any way we could have some more detail on that. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you,
Diane, when you're
Councillor. ready. I don't have the figures with me to hand, but if that is something that the committee would like to see, then certainly I can forward that and share that information. We can certainly. You're right in terms of it being underreported, I think, and we can certainly pull those figures and share those with you.
Okay, thank you. Can't see anyone else with hands up. We'll move over to the next part of the report, which is presented by Nicole Hilton, Assistant Director of Communities. Nicole, are you there, please?
Good morning, Chairman. Good morning, committee. I'm actually going to hand directly over to Will Mason, if that's okay. He's the Head of Service for Culture and he's much closer to this activity, and he'll be able to give an awful lot more detail. So over to Will.
Okay, sure, thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Good morning, Chairman. Good morning, everyone. It's been obviously a quite atypical year for culture in terms of performance reporting, and particularly in Q4, which saw our heritage sites still closed and our libraries not operating at full capacity. The performance in many ways doesn't really capture the successes that we have had during the last year, the role of libraries as a very important source of information and access to the internet for job searches during what's been a very difficult time for our communities, and also with regards to how some of our heritage locations, when our indoor venues have been closed to the public, we've still been able to open places like the grounds of Lincoln Castle, which have become safe spaces for our communities. This said, I'm very happy to go through the performance as reported here. I won't dwell too much on the libraries because obviously actually later on this morning's agenda, we do have a full report on year 5 of the libraries performance reporting, which will go into a lot more detail. And my colleague Louise will talk you through that. And I'm also pleased to say that I believe we have Nicola Rogers from GLL, our libraries partner as well, who would be able to answer questions. So in terms of library performance, as I mentioned, we weren't able to open fully for browsing during Q4. So this is reflected in the fact that we didn't achieve our target with regards to visits to core libraries and mobile library services. Click and collect was very, very gratefully received. And I think, you know, it's been very heartening to see how our communities have responded to our libraries. But as I'm sure everyone can understand, we weren't able to actually hit a target when we weren't fully able to open our libraries. With regards to visits to library websites, however, what we've seen is quite an interesting trend. During the initial first lockdown, we saw an exponential increase in engagement with our e-services, so e-books, e-magazines, and the e-audio services. And this is reflected that even though we were closed to the public for full browsing, we have actually exceeded our target for visits to the library website by more than 10%. In terms of community use of libraries, our libraries for the whole of the year have been closed for full activity in those kind of community uses, which are usually so very, very strong. So the actual target, we not only didn't reach the target, but we actually had zero engagement with communities, which of course was very disappointing, but understandable considering the situation and our need to ensure that our communities are kept safe. I'm very happy, once I've kind of just gone through heritage as well, if it's useful to the committee, I can give a very brief update on what our performance has been like the last 2 to 4 weeks, which I think will give a slightly better indication, particularly with full restrictions going on the 19th. That kind of gives us a sense of what the rest of the year is going to look like as well. In terms of those heritage performance indicators, we did just fall short of the contact with Heritage Service through either in person, on phone, email, or via the website. Again, for the majority of last year, our sites were either fully closed to the public, except for Lincoln Castle Grounds, which was able to open for everything apart from the first lockdown. But as a result, there has been less interaction with the website in terms of people logging on to see what events are going on, what exhibitions, what our opening hours are, etc. But we have had some successes, even though it didn't make up those numbers, in terms of some of the digital engagement that we have carried out with the public. And that's been very heartening. We've worked with a number of other partners, including universities, not just Lincoln University, but also Edinburgh University, to try and engage with our audiences digitally. And that's really been reflected in keeping that excitement and interest in heritage going, so that as we have reopened, we've seen a very swift and positive response to people coming back into our sites. In terms of overall enjoyment of the services as measured by our visitor survey forms, again, we've not been able to capture this data even when we were open in the way that we usually would, due to the COVID secure safety mechanisms that we had in place when we have been open. That's involved not handing out paper forms to be filled in. So we haven't really been able to capture a lot of data. However, in terms of the cumulative total for the whole of the year, when we were actually able to capture some data in a slightly different way at the castle earlier in the year, I'm very pleased to say that we did get a 100% return in terms of our visitors rating their experience as either very good or excellent. It's also worth me mentioning that this has been reflected in what is a very important performance indicator in a slightly different way in terms of people's reviews on TripAdvisor. So again, all of our sites continue to be rated as excellent through TripAdvisor. As I say, Chairman, if it's of use, I'm quite happy to just give a couple of minutes update on performance as we're kind of seeing it during July, or answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Will. You clearly know your subject. You was on a roll there. Have we got any questions for Will? Councillor Brockway.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, the information is extremely interesting. Thank you. As we've talked about libraries, could I just ask about the hubs, please? I understand that the initial agreement for 15,000 odd plus 5,000 odd a year is coming to an end. We're on year 5 and it goes to year 6 next year. And I wonder what's in place to help those organisations after year 6, please. Thank you, Chairman.
Yeah, I'm very happy. Sorry, Councillor Pepper.
Yes, sorry. Able to answer that, Will?
Yes, absolutely. I'm very pleased to say that there is no intent to stop the £5,000 a year revenue support. The £15,000 was a one-off capital investment. Some of the hubs have spent this, some of the hubs have spent some of it so far. But in terms of the ongoing revenue support, there is no intent to stop that moving forwards. We do see that our hubs are increasingly an incredibly important community asset. They deliver and achieve much more than I think any of us anticipated. Their impact, their penetration goes way beyond just being a library service. I think much as those libraries were excellent when they were operated by Lincolnshire County Council, by being fully embedded in the local community, that what they deliver and how they connect with their local communities is, honestly, I couldn't praise it any higher. And we see this as an incredibly important thing moving forward. So there is no intent to remove that funding.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Stokes.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. No, it relates to contact with the Heritage Service. It says in the notes below, obviously we handed back the Gainsborough Old Hall. Is that going to make an impact on the targets going forward? Thank you.
Okay, Will.
Yeah, it's a very fair question. It will. I think obviously we are losing the physical visits that we used to get to Gainsborough Hall, which would be to the tune of about 30,000. And obviously those other kind of engagements through website, phone calls, etc. It will make a difference. I'm pleased to be able to say that I'm very optimistic about the general direction of travel. However, I think the last couple of years, or certainly prior to COVID, but what we're seeing post-COVID as well, I think is incredibly heartening. So I've reasonable optimism to suggest that we will be able to make up the lost engagement from Gainsborough Hall through the kind of the improvements and the continued in performance that we're seeing across the rest of the service.
Okay, thank you. I can't see anyone else wishing to ask any questions, so we'll turn to Lee Surdyfield next for his presentation.
Good morning, Councillor Pepper and the committee. So a quick overview for the voluntary information in the pack. You can see from the page 39 that the number of voluntary groups actively supported in Lincolnshire has met its target. We know that has seen some changes throughout the year due to the impact of the pandemic. And you can see that certainly early on in the year, the number of groups supported were far higher than at other points. That's partly because we only count the interaction once, but what we have seen is an ongoing demand for support throughout the year. We'll need to review this target in future years, and we're working actively at the moment with VCS to understand how we can better provide support to voluntary and community groups, but also how we can tailor that support to some of the individuals that will be volunteering outside of this. As the paper says, as a response to the pandemic, a number of groups were set up quite quickly early in the year. Not all of those have been formed as formal groups, so not all of them will be going through the processes that VCS would require for that interaction. But as part of the community strategy that we'll come on to shortly in the agenda, we'll be looking at how we continue to engage and develop interactions with those. When we look at the number of people that have been supported to access volunteering opportunities, we've seen excellent performance in that area with just over 2,000 people being supported against a target of 1,400. Again, that recognises the changes and the challenges that the pandemic has presented. What we're likely to see is a change in performance in future years, where we know that some voluntary groups are now finding it challenging to bring volunteers back into their organisations, particularly with the skills that they require for the future. So certainly from conversations with people like Citizens Advice, there's been some challenge in getting the knowledge and experience that's required to provide some of those accredited services in the future. But again, we intend to pick up that challenge through the dialogue within the community strategy. You can see throughout the year on the final page, on page 52 of the pack, that the level of support has been relatively consistent throughout the year. And like I say, it's exceeded the target. But I'm more than happy, Councillor Pepper, to take any questions that the committee may have.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Key, did you wish to ask a question?
Yes, sorry, Mr. Chairman. It was about the previous speaker.
I
He
wondered
did
if
say
it was.
he was.
You came in at the tail end of that one, yeah, sure, yeah.
He did say he was going to update us on the visitor numbers in the last few weeks since restrictions were eased. So maybe we could go back to that later if there's time.
Okay, yeah, we'll go back to that later then, yeah, sure, thank you. So any questions for Lee, please? Councillor Stokes? None? Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry, Councillor Dunny.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just it's a question actually is, how are we doing with the mental health well-being of the communities in Lincolnshire? Can we get any figures or any statistics or any information on that? Because I think during the pandemic, a lot of people have been suffering with the mental issues.
Sure.
Thank you.
Is that something you're able to answer, Lee?
That's not something that's monitored directly through the indicators that have been presented today. Through the community and voluntary cell as part of the COVID response and recovery activity, there is work underway to support mental health and well-being in communities. I can take the question away and look to bring some further information back to the committee in the future if that would be helpful, because I know there's extensive work that's been undertaken by colleagues in that area.
Sorry, thank you. Any further questions for Lee? Okay, thank you. We'll move on then to Mark Baxter, the Chief Fire Officer, for his presentation.
Good morning, Councillor Pepper, committee. First of all, I'm going to hand over to Assistant Chief Fire Officer Ryan Stacey, who's the head of our performance and data. He's going to just talk you through the update for our latest performance, if that's okay. Thank you, Councillor.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So it falls to me to provide an update on the 5 performance measures that we provide. In a nutshell, we've achieved across all areas. I'll go through one by one and then I'll take questions at the end if that's convenient for you. The first one on page 19 are primary fires. So these are fires that involve property, so buildings, vehicles, that kind of thing. We've achieved our target. The 2 most common causes of fire in these 2 areas continue to be dwellings and vehicles. And the second biggest, that accounts for 2/3, the second biggest is farm-related agricultural fires. We've seen a big reduction in the number of farm-related fires, down from 149 in 18-19 down to 91 in our past year and down to 79 in this year. This is largely down to some partnership work we've been doing with the National Farmers Union, and it's resulted in a significant reduction in those 2 areas. The next measure is fire fatalities in primary fires. So that's those fires involving property. We have sadly had 3 fire fatalities in the last 12-month period. We did have one which was changed from being as a result of fire to being caused outside of fire. But sadly, we had another fire-related fire in March of this year, bringing the total back up to 3 fire-related fatalities. Deliberate primary fires. So again, these are deliberate fires involving property. We have achieved against our target. The 2 most common fires continue to be vehicles and dwellings. We've seen reductions in both those areas. So we will continue to work particularly with police and the Safer Lincolnshire partnership to ensure that we have interventions in place to reduce those deliberate fires in those areas. Deliberate secondary fires, so these are deliberate fires that are not involving property. We have seen a marginal reduction of one deliberate fire over the last 12-month period. Although we're marginally above our target, we are still within tolerance. The numbers in that area are very small. As I say, we have one fire less than we did last year, albeit we had a slightly more ambitious target. The last measure we report on are accidental dwelling fires. We have seen a small reduction of 2 accidental dwelling fires in the last 12 months. The most common cause continues to be cooking appliances, and the second most common is electrical items. The focus for 21-22 will be to do some risk-based work, promoting particularly safety standards around electrical items. I'm more than happy to take any questions that you may have on that.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Any questions? Councillor Lee, sorry. Must put my glasses on.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask, I understand that the fire service deal with flooding too, and I wondered what level of work, because obviously they're not reporting on that, but it is something that they have to deal with. I think from memory that they don't get extra funding for it either, but I'm not sure about that. So can you tell me a little bit about the level of flooding incidents that you have to deal with in Lincolnshire, please?
Okay, Ryan.
Thank you. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Yeah, the Fire and Rescue Service aren't currently funded to respond to flooding incidents, but it is something that we do respond to as it is a life risk and something that we would clearly have. We've got significant resources, both in terms of pumping appliances and large numbers of personnel to assist in those incidents. We tend to receive calls for service around fluvial flooding, which is as a result of rainfall and rivers. We get a fair amount of flash flooding as a result of significant rainfall, as we've seen around the country due to thunderstorm activity over the last couple of days. We've not had any significant calls to service over the last few weeks as a result of those types of incidents, not like we've seen in London, etc. But it is something we keep an eye on. Our integrated risk management plan, which we refresh every 3 or 4 years, does have flooding and flood risk as one of our priorities to make sure that we're adequately resourced in those areas, that we have the right resources in the right areas and the right staffing and the right training for those staff. So the numbers of calls to service we have is increasing. We work with partner agencies such as the Environment Agency and the Local Resilience Forum to make sure that we are prepared for those types of incidents. And we're also building into our community safety programme when we go out and speak to vulnerable residents around fire prevention. We're talking to them also about protecting themselves from flooding. So some basic things that they can do within their own residence to make sure that when they experience a flooding event, they can be prepared for it in advance. Tips like making sure that the sorts of things that people historically that you can't replace, things like photographs, etc., making sure that they are stored upstairs, and making sure that as the risk of flooding increases, you've got a grab bag, medication, that kind of thing to be able to leave your premises in a hurry. So we're able to provide that advice through the LRF with our partners when we go and deliver our safe and well visits.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just come back, please? We've got the executive portfolio holder member here. Can I ask going forward that this committee is kept informed about the work that the fire service is doing around flooding, particularly because it's not funded, because that's clearly going to have an impact on their performance in other areas if they're having to divert resources. I was always a firm advocate for the fire service, and that's not going to change. So can I ask, please, Councillor Curry, that going forward this is included in reports, because with climate change I can only see this getting actually an even bigger part of their workload. Thank you.
Good question. Councillor Corey, are you able to answer that?
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for your question. I will be happy to see that. I'm obviously going to put more work on our officers pulling that information together, but in light of what's been happening in our country in the south, near London, we experienced quite a bit of it in Wainfleet recently, and those appalling deaths in southwest Germany, including 4 firefighters who went to rescue people. I think that's something that's very much at the forefront of our mind, so I'd be very supportive of seeing that information. Thank you. But the Chief Fire Officer is just off camera. I'm sure he'd be happy to respond positively to that as well. Thank you.
This is supposed to be supportive of the fire service,
Sure.
not challenging. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Just see a hand up over here. I think it's Councillor Key first and then Councillor Brockway.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to know a bit more about the work that the fire service have been doing with the NFU for farm fires, because they reported quite a dramatic decline in farm fires. They can be really distressing, particularly for the farmers themselves. They can lose so much crops and materials, as well as the risk to life. And with climate change that Councillor Lees mentioned with flooding, the other side of that is the extreme weather conditions for heat, which we've had in the last few weeks. So if we could have a bit more information about that, because whatever you've been doing has obviously been successful. So thank you.
Thank you. Ryan, are you able to answer that, please?
Yeah, of course. So a lot of it stems around education. I mean, clearly there's mutual benefit in ensuring that the types of fires we get in agriculture tend to be significant agricultural machinery, so balers, harvesters, that kind of thing, and of course storage facilities like barns, etc. Now, of course, there's mutual benefit. There's huge disruption to farms and agriculture if either of those areas become out of use due to fire. So us being able to provide timely information to farmers in terms of mainly housekeeping around industrial agricultural equipment. So we tend to find with harvesters in particular, huge buildups of dry, very combustible material in hard to reach parts of the harvesters, causes a buildup of heat and then combustion, and of course it then renders some very, very expensive machinery unusable for a considerable period of time. And of course, as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of this equipment is not owned by the farm. It's brought in and leased and goes from farm to farm to farm. So clearly there is significant disruption when that type of high value, high risk machinery is out of action. So we work with the leases of that equipment. We work with the farmers just to raise awareness around the need to make sure those hard to reach areas are cleaned and maintained on a daily basis to ensure there isn't a buildup of combustible material, which of course reduces the risk therefore of that vehicle being out of use and unable to capitalise on the good weather to bring in a harvest, etc. If it would be of any use, I'm sure we can provide some case studies to the executive and indeed this committee around some of the work we've been doing, particularly around the NFU and reducing agricultural fires.
Okay, thank you. Just before I take Councillor Brockway, I understand Nicole Hilton wanted to come in there.
Yes, Chairman.
Okay, Nicole, are you there?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. It was just a comment actually about the information being requested about flooding. Of course, that sits in a different scrutiny, so that fits in the water and flood scrutiny. So actually, I wouldn't see it as being too much of an additional burden on office, because the information that goes to that scrutiny could also then be shared and circulated with this scrutiny.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. Councillor Brockway.
Thank you, Chairman. I have two questions, if I may, please. One comes out of Councillor Lee's comments about the flooding. Had a number of recent incidents where we've gone along and done some beautiful work on roads, but in doing so, we've raised the level of the road surfaces. And it's then caused flooding in residents' gardens. This has been reported to highways, but we've also had incidents where the raising of the road level has actually blocked those little drains that are in the curbs, you know, the runaway. They're now covered in tarmac. Now, this then becomes a flooding incident as well as a highways incident. And I'm wondering if I can refer this to you and maybe refer this to the fire service, because this has been raised not just in my division, but elsewhere in West Lindsey. And there's considerable concern about it because it is flooding and it has actually gone into houses. So I'm just drawing that to your attention as something I might sort of say, can we have this under our umbrella as well as highways, please? But the other thing that I find very worrying, we've been talking about domestic fires, and I had conversation with a local fire officer about the need to close doors, about education around domestic fires. We've all seen these programs on the TV where they light a Christmas tree or something and you get this flash fire going over. And along with a lot of other people, I believed that there was a certain amount of time to get out. I knew it was a very short time, but it was only when I had a conversation with this fire officer, he said, you're talking about 4 or 5 breaths. You know, people will say, oh, a minute, and you think, oh, I can get out of a room in a minute. It sounds as if it's time to get from where you are to get out of a room. But when you phrase it differently and just talk about 4 or 5 breaths, first of all, is that accurate? Am I saying something here that is correct? Because I don't want to disseminate wrong information. But if that's the case, I wonder if that sort of information might go into the education that we put out there, because it really shocked me. And as a result, it changed my behaviour in my house at night. Always got the smoke alarms, but now I close every door, which I didn't do before that conversation. And so I'm just raising it about the different perception just by having something phrased differently. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you. We're digressing a bit from the report, but Ryan, are you happy to take those questions?
Yes, certainly very happy. Certainly on the flooding thing, it's something we've not noticed a significant number of road-related flooding incidents that result in a call to our service. Clearly, we need to be significant flooding where there's life risk for us to become involved. So I don't know that we've seen any particular upturn, but we can certainly work with colleagues within LCC to look at that. In particular, around the messaging around home fire safety, certainly that is something, and I'm pleased that you've picked up on it. But certainly, it's a change in the narrative that we've had. Traditionally, we've talked about time that people have, but you're absolutely right. It's actually the number of breaths. The result of 5 fatalities, people die of smoke inhalation. They very rarely die of burns. So the reality is it's the number of breaths that you have in a non-breathable environment, which is going to be the killer in most cases.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Any further questions on this subject? Okay, we'll move on then to, last but not least, Stephen Batchelor from the Lincolnshire Road Safety Partnership. Over to you, Steve.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman. Hello, committee. Looking at the report then on page 39, what we can see January to March is a lower number of people killed and seriously injured, which is historically consistent and to be expected. However, in the second quarter, April to June, 78 is lower than we would generally see and is directly related to COVID and the various lockdowns. The last 2 quarters, where there were 133 and 138 people killed or seriously injured, respectively, again, that is consistent with what we would consider a normal year. In terms of those people who were killed and seriously injured, they were occurring predominantly in rural areas, again, which is consistent except for pedestrian, pedal cycle and low-powered two-wheel motor vehicles. Again, which would be expected, and again, predominantly male casualties, although that's more consistent, more even in the child category. On the next page, in terms of annual comparisons, in 2020 overall, there were 446 people killed or seriously injured on the roads, which is a 16.5% reduction on the 2019 figure of 536. There was an increase in pedal cycles overall from 34 to 55. This was one of my concerns at the beginning of the lockdown, in that as more people were using pedal cycles for leisure, as that was one of the areas in which they were able to leave the house, that there was a slight risk there, and I say an increase from 34 to 55 demonstrates that. In terms of the chart that shows the comparison with other counties, I note it's 2017, and I believe we've done that because it's been a move on from each year. But for the next report, Mr. Chairman, I would look to try and update that a little bit more and try and get us at least 2019 figures. But for the one that's in there, it does show us relatively close to the top in terms of the number of people killed and seriously injured, which again is historically roughly where we've been, although it moves ever so slightly up and down. On pages 41 and 42, where we look specifically at child KSIs, it's very difficult, of course, to make a direct comparison with other years because of the various restrictions, lockdowns and impacts on schools. But in 2020 overall, there were 24. In 2019, that was 37, and 2018, it was 28. So again, we can see a reduction. Interestingly, in terms of the child figures, the pedestrian child KSIs were 37% of the figures in 2020, which is quite a reduction on the 2015 to 2019 average, whereby 46% of child KSIs were in the pedestrian category. And the main shift in this period in 2020 was there were more passenger child KSI injuries, as you probably would expect, again, with lockdowns and those children being in vehicles that were then involved in a collision. I'm happy to take questions on any element of the information there or any other questions you might have.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Councillor Mrs Clark.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'd just like to ask, really, I live close to a red route, and my question is about messaging. And I've thought about this for some time. With the messaging, where a route is highlighted as a red route, it's a dangerous route, and in Lincolnshire we do have some pretty dangerous roads. Does the messaging around red routes or any other routes, does that make a difference to the data that you collect towards the end of the year? Can you see where there's been a difference where you've put messaging out about how dangerous the route is, please?
Thank you, Councillor. It's going to be very difficult to correlate any sort of messaging or education in general. It's one of the three areas that we focus on: enforcement, engineering and education. And the education side, of course, is very difficult to demonstrate that you have directly contributing to a collision that might have happened than not happening. However, in the past, where we've done a lot of work specifically on certain routes, messaging can play a part, but I think it needs to be backed up with other efforts. So we need to look at the areas in which sections of route or junctions have particular problems, and we also need to look at what level of enforcement we can put at the locations where the highest number of people are exceeding the limits and doing other road traffic offences. So I guess, yes, it can certainly play a part, although it's hard to demonstrate directly, but it needs to be backed up by other interventions as well.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Councillor Danny.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions. The first one, which is, I think, he may just have touched on it, is does the conditions of our roads in Lincolnshire, especially particularly some areas, contribute to the accidents on the road? That's one thing. The second thing, 3 weeks ago, we had a lady around, I think, Freedville near Boston, has died because she rolled the car to a dike. And it's the road basically where she had the accident is very dangerous, it's very wavy, so you cannot keep to that. Is there anything to be done to just put maybe barriers or whatever we can put on the side so people are aware of the dikes on each side, because sometimes they're on the right and left. And for me, it raises a lot of concerns, because when I drive on these roads, it is really dangerous, especially if there is a lady driving with kids or anything in the car. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. That cross-cuts a little bit with highways, but are you able to answer that, Steve?
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Councillor. So the first question, does the condition of the roads contribute to accidents? For the vast majority of collisions anywhere in the UK, anywhere in the world, driver error is going to be one of the primary contributory factors in one way, shape or form. So what we would always say is that people need to drive to the conditions. I know it's simplifying things a lot, but if the vehicle is stationary, then of course a collision isn't going to occur. So I think people need to understand that when they live in a large rural community such as this, where there's lots of single carriageway, fast speed roads, mixing agricultural vehicles, leisure vehicles, motorcycles, etc., that there is an increased risk of collisions, and all of those things kind of go into the melting pot and make Lincolnshire have a higher number of people killed or seriously injured in other areas. But of course, the condition of the roads is one of the factors that's going to play a role. So the better the standard of the road, then the safer that they are going to be. For example, the major trunk road network, such as motorways, are going to be consistently the most safe roads that you can drive on. So as you move away from those major road networks where the traffic is separated, that's going to play a role. So I think what I would say is the condition of the roads can contribute if people don't modify their behaviour and their driving style whilst they're on them. Secondly, with regard to that specific incident at Frithville, that's clearly still under investigation through the collision investigation team at Lincolnshire Police, so I can't comment on that specifically. In terms of barriers on the side of the roads, I think any barriers that separate the traffic from risk, whether that's other road users or other areas of concern on the road network, that's beneficial. It is very much a highways issue. I don't have responsibility or budget for that type of activity. But my understanding is that for the lengths of roads that we have and the difficulty in building them, it would be exceedingly difficult for us to put barriers over the road network in the way that you've suggested. But quite clearly, where there are dikes on either side or where there are trees on either side of the roads, where there is an incident and somebody does lose control, then it is more likely that that's going to involve a more serious or fatal injury.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Key.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to say something about the speed of vehicles, because that's the thing that comes up with me all the time through some of my villages. And when I've inquired about measuring speeds through communities, it's an average speed, I think, that is normally quoted, where that doesn't always seem to me to be the most practical way of doing it. I was reading a Speedwatch report from a village yesterday, and it was a 30-mile limit, and a car had gone through at 52. Well, if they just reported the average speed, it would probably have still only have been 30 or 31 miles an hour. But it's the exceptional speeds, I think, that need also to be concentrated on, because 52 in a 30 is absolutely diabolical. But it sometimes those are masked when only average speeds are quoted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I think you're absolutely right that we need to look at more information and share more information. What I would say is that every time a concerned resident or a parish or a town council come into the Road Safety Partnership with their concerns, and we do not have recent data, so we haven't completed a survey in the 3-year period before that, we will always undertake a new survey and an analysis of the collisions at that location. Now, when we do that assessment, clearly every single vehicle and therefore every single speed is recorded. And when I make my assessment as to whether or not there is a suitable intervention that's required, we look into all of those measures. So we look at the average speed of vehicles, I look at the number and percentage of vehicles exceeding the limit, I look at the number and percentage of vehicles that are exceeding the limit at a level that the police would undertake speed enforcement. I then also look at the number and the averages of higher speeders. So how many are going 10 mile an hour above the limit, how many are going 20 mile an hour above the limit. We then combine that with the collisions, and I collate all that information and assess it based on a score and a risk. Now, it might well be that in terms of our correspondence with the parish or back to the community, just providing an average speed will oversimplify that. So I think making it clear that we are assessing all of those other factors is vitally important. But what I would also say is that you're absolutely right that those outliers, those excessive speeders, are vital. And as I've just mentioned there, they are recorded. But I do think there is merit and value in the average speed as well. So where we're looking at using the resources that we have, if you have a location where the average speed of vehicles is, let's say, 3 or 4 miles per hour below the speed limit, and there are some excessive speeders, it's still important for us to recognise that the vast majority of people using that road are doing so safely and within the limit. And that's why I use all of those different factors. So it has a place to pay, but it's not the only thing that we consider.
Thank you. Could I just come back? I think it would be very helpful for parishes particularly if more information could be provided if you've already got it, not just the average speed. So if the number of cars doing as I stated, 52, but however you wish to record it, because that's something which has been brought to me several times already. That would be really helpful if the information is already to hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Just again to clarify, there in the narrative that's sent out, to provide something that's not too overly complex. The average is in there, but I agree with you. We will start to add in the further information. But when we return that information to the parish, we do include the report, which has that information in there as well. So it involves opening up the PDF and then looking and going through. But that is provided to communities. But in the narrative, in the initial email or letter that's sent out, it may well not be. But I can certainly change that and make sure all of that information is readily available.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Brockway.
Thank you for letting me come back, Chairman. I wonder if I could ask a question here, please. Does this information all come to you automatically? I mean, there's a stretch of road in my division. We've had 2 fatalities in the last month, and there have been numerous accidents previously. So clearly something needs to be done about this. How does that process about something needs to be done start? It's a very dangerous stretch of road with a very dangerous junction, A57 to B1190. So how does that start and how do we get something moving? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Steve.
Thank you, Councillor. There's a number of different ways that it might occur. We periodically undertake cluster site analysis. So we will look at junctions, routes, sections of road, and look at whether or not there have been a number of collisions in there, if there's a pattern starting to emerge where some action might need to be taken. It may be that the Forensic Collision Investigation team of Lincolnshire Police, who sit within the Road Safety Partnership, raise some locations to us because they've noted that they've been to one or more collisions at that location in the recent past. Then, of course, county councillors, local councillors, parish councillors, residents, they also raise concern to us, and we will then investigate those concerns. So there are a number of different ways in which we can start to look at an issue or a problem that might be emerging.
Really sorry, when you say us, who do you mean exactly? How do I get this to the right person exactly, please?
Sorry, as I was given the report on the Road Safety Partnership, so I can only speak for us. I've done it again, sorry. And when I say us, I mean the Road Safety Partnership. But if you address it to myself, Councillor, I can certainly ensure we look into that.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Before we move on from this report, there's an outstanding question from Councillor Key to Will Mason. Will, if you're there, are you able to answer that question, or would you like it spoke again?
No, I'm very happy to answer the question, Councillor Pepper. Thank you very much. And indeed, thank you for the opportunity to just give a brief update on our more recent performance, because I think it is both more indicative of what's kind of happening as we he says, crossing his fingers, come out of COVID, but also as we look ahead to the summer and the rest of the year. So what we're finding is that there is quite a strong national kind of trend at the moment, with people finding themselves more confident, more comfortable as they go back out into going into larger buildings, larger spaces, but particularly outdoor spaces. And we have seen this reflected to an extent in people returning to our services as well. But I'm pleased to say that we're also actually bucking the trend, in that our services tend to be based in urban areas which aren't necessarily doing so well. So what we're finding is that there's a bit of variance between what's been a very, very positive response to libraries opening back up for full browsing, and what I think gives us that degree of confidence that as time progresses, we will comfortably return back to pre-COVID engagement levels. What we're seeing in some of our heritage sites that are mainly indoor focused, where we're getting maybe 60, 70% plus of the visitors that we were getting for the equivalent period in 2019 as that kind of most recent pre-COVID kind of benchmark. But then we're also seeing in those sites that have got more of an outdoor option available, that Lincoln Castle is already back up to 88% of its paid visits. Now, this is significantly ahead of what we're seeing in large visitor attractions in the rest of the country. Some of it's anecdotal, but there was quite a large kind of article recently where where York themselves described the city as being empty, and they're just not getting anywhere near that level of visits. And Lincoln Castle, possibly more than some of our other offers, has relied over the years, or not relied, but benefited is a better word, from visitors from further afield, not just our local communities and people from Lincolnshire, but people from further away in Britain, but also overseas as well. So to have reached 88% within a couple of weeks, really, of reopening with restrictions really being reduced only even more recently than that is fantastic. But also what we're seeing is not only that kind of increased number of visitors to the grounds that we found during lockdowns has been reflected in many of those people's being converted to paying visitors. So actually, with the combination of the central government's kind of recovery funding support of the reduction in VAT in our sector, and how our visitors are now kind of interacting with the ticket choices, we're actually up on admissions from our pre-COVID levels, which we're just absolutely delighted about, and I think has really just actually quantified that response that we felt in our local communities. Museum of Lincolnshire Live is another example. We had another look at the numbers for the past 4 weeks on this yesterday, and it's actually sitting at 98% of its pre-COVID visits. Now, when you are looking across the country and across the sector, and you're seeing other areas getting less than half of their pre-COVID visits, this is obviously just absolutely fantastic. We're seeing some quite exciting trends in libraries. So although we acknowledge that it'll take a little bit longer to get back to those pre-COVID in-person visits, with the slight kind of, not nervousness, but I suppose still people sort of making sure that they feel comfortable, and all of the people that have been into our libraries since we've reopened and since restrictions were removed only last week, just over a week ago, what we're finding is that our visitors are finding themselves very happy to be back in libraries. That obviously all of the mandatory restrictions have gone, but most people are still wearing masks, and they're finding that actually that because other people are wearing masks as well, they do feel very confident. But one of the real positives is that during the first lockdown, when we had that exponential engagement with e-services I mentioned earlier, although now people are able to take books out in person, that has gone down some. It hasn't gone down to what the levels before were. So we're still seeing overall a general increase in engagement because we've maintained some of that early electronic engagement. So overall, I think we're very excited and we're very happy that we're kind of batting above our weight compared to the national picture, although that kind of sense of people kind of engaging with outdoor spaces and larger spaces is still reflected to an extent in our service as well. Happy to answer any questions.
Well, I believe you've answered all the questions, but does that answer your question, Councillor Key?
It does, Mr. Chairman, and it's nice to finish with such positive, great news for Lincolnshire. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I can't see any further questions, no. Okay, so our actions for this item is that the Public Protection and Community Scrutiny Committee are invited to review and comment on the performance information contained in this report and highlight any recommendations or further actions for consideration. Proposal, I move that the committee receive the report and are satisfied with the overall performance for Q4. And I believe, Katrina, I've seen you busy there, right? And I guess you've captured everything we've said there. Yeah, thank you. So I'm proposing, can you raise your hand if you agree? That's unanimous, thank you. We'll now move on to item 6, which is community strategy. This is a pre-decision item found in pages 53 to 114 of the agenda pack, which invites the committee to consider and comment on a report regarding the community strategy prior to a decision being taken by the executive in September. The report will be presented by Lee Surdyfield, who is the Assistant Director Corporate. The views of the committee will be reported to the executive when it considers a decision on the 7th of December. Over to you, Lee.
Thank you. I don't know if Councillor Woolley wanted to come in first to introduce the item. Councillor Pepper.
Well, thank you for the offer, Lee. I'm sure you'll do a really great job. Probably to the committee, I just wanted to say to them, I think that this is almost it's that phrase, a live document, in that engaging with our communities, engaging with our public, it's something that we need to do all the time. We need to be alive to the different ways that we do it, so that we then can inform at every opportunity the work of the County Council. So I'm going to hand back to Lee now, and he's going to put some, as they say, meat on these bones. Thank you, Lee.
Lee, you're muted.
Muted.
Thank you. Apologies. So the community strategy contained within the pack details how we plan to respond and build upon the position of the pandemic and the excellent work that has gone in there, and how we start to tailor services around community need. Now, you'll see within the report that the community strategy is split into a number of sections, and the intention is that each of those sections complement each other, but also need to be read across to other strategies that are currently in development. So areas such as our customer strategy and our digital strategy will be supporting the delivery of the community strategy. So what I thought I could do is just take you through at a high level the themes within the strategy, and then be more than happy to take any questions from the committee. But firstly, the consultation, engagement and collaboration section is all about how we formally engage where there's a requirement to do so, but also how we engage with communities to find out opinion and to inform policy, and to get essential feedback that will help us to deliver better services in the future. So this picks up on the work that the team already do, but it looks at how we move that forward and try and get more representative feedback that committees such as yours would then be able to consider in the future. The engagement work isn't purely with residents, it is also with representative groups. And this links over into the community networks theme. So within that, we are saying that within our community, there are strong established networks that we need to be able to engage with and work with on a regular basis. And we need to ensure that through the strategy, we gain a better understanding of what those networks offer. But we also need to be able to identify gaps and then look at how we work with communities to fill any gaps that exist. Now, we recognise that through the work to respond to the pandemic, a number of organisations had started up, and some of those will continue, some of them won't. So we need to understand what is out there and how we best use that community resource to get the best outcomes and support the objectives of the corporate plan. For volunteering, this is really thinking about volunteering in three different ways. So firstly, this is about volunteering to give people the skills that they need to move into employment. So it's supporting people to access voluntary positions, to gain confidence, to gain exposure, to gain skills and experience that enables them to progress into the job market and further their horizons. Secondly, this is around ensuring that those with experience are able to give something back in simple terms. So it's about how do we match people with a range of skills to opportunities in the smartest possible way. And then finally, we're also looking at how we understand and promote the social value that volunteering gives to our local communities. In terms of funding, the funding for our communities is about ensuring that volunteering community groups are aware of the funding opportunities that are available to them. We already promote those through the grant finder tools, but we want to look at how we enhance that, but also how we encourage collaboration within those communities to stand a better chance of bringing money into Lincolnshire. What we're also doing as part of the funding theme is reviewing both the funding that is made available to Citizens Advice Lincolnshire and the 4 CABs, and to the volunteering community sector support groups. This is to ensure that that represents value for money and that the activities that they complete is tailored towards the needs of Lincolnshire. And we expect to be bringing papers back to the committee later this year with updates on performance in that area. The final theme is around tools and data. So this is really about how we go about doing this. It's about how do we engage, consult and collaborate. It's about how do we share key messages, and it's about how do we analyse the information that comes back so that we're able to make informed decisions upon that, but also cross-reference between different consultations. So how do we ensure that that data is structured and maintained in a way that gives us the optimum value in the future? So this links into the data strategy work, and this sees us investing in some new tools and technologies to enhance the way that we engage with communities and to give us a greater level of analysis around the information that comes back. So as you highlighted, Councillor Pepper, at the start, the intention is that the strategy moves on to executive on the 7th of September. So what we're asking for today is for you to consider the report and the various attachments, and I'm more than willing to answer any questions that may come up around that. And then we'd like you to recommend the paper to executive with any additional comments that you may wish to make. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lee. Any questions? I think Councillor Stokes, followed by Councillor Lee.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. The biggest concern I've got is the lack of responses. I mean, it says in the report there was only 39 responses, and we seem to have done the whole strategy on the back of 39 responses, looking through the report. Could Lee tell me why he feels that the response was so low, considering the range of mechanisms that we used, according to the report?
The level of response to engagement activities is recognised as being low, both for this and for other activities that we've completed. So I think you're raising a good point, Councillor Stokes. What we had was the 39 responses contained within the pack, but we also did a whole series of engagement with voluntary groups and representative bodies as part of the strategy development. So we worked with a number of organisations, including VET and involving links as examples, to test the content of the strategy and inform that prior to the engagement, the formal engagement commencing. So a number of organisations have already seen it and had debate and influenced that. Now we recognise that we need to move to a position where we get a more representative view through engagement activity. This activity was completed over a 3-week time period, so there's a limit in terms of how many people will respond. But there's also a limit at the moment in terms of who tends to engage in this type of activity. We want to, through this strategy, build a greater awareness of networks to be able to promote our engagement activities across the board and seek a greater level of response, and also identify ways of being more proactive to ensure that we get balanced views. That includes being able to use the networks that others have got available to them. So leveraging the resources that others have got to be able to get more representative views. So I think you're correct. It's a limited response, but there was extensive engagement prior to the formal consultation period.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Lee, followed by Councillor Key.
Thank you. I've got a question and an observation to make around point 16, talks about citizens' advice in Lincolnshire, and it says here there are 4 regional hubs. My initial question is, where are the 4 regional hubs? I'd like to make a comment after that, please.
Okay. So the 4 hubs are geographically spread around Lincolnshire, and we fund through the Citizen Advice Lincolnshire, which is the umbrella body. Each of them operate as independent bodies, but come back through the Lincolnshire. So there's a South Lincolnshire one, there's one on the East Coast, West Lindsey, and a city. So we can provide details for you as to the areas that each of them cover. I'm more than happy to share information about the geography, the specific geography that each one covers, but also take any further questions that you may have, Councillor Lee.
Yeah, I wanted to actually know where those 4 hubs are. In which towns or cities are those 4 hubs, please?
So they they operate from different bases. Now, of late, the offer has been through predominantly through a telephony service, whereas previously they would have had office accommodation that sometimes is provided through district councils as benefit in kind. Sometimes it's provided within other market towns. But what I think it's best that I come back to you with the latest operating picture, so that I give you the most accurate representation of the current offer, because I know that's something that's evolved over the pandemic period. But I'll make sure I come back to you with the most recent and the most up-to-date information there.
Thanks. That's not really helpful. What I was trying to establish was where exactly are these 4 regional hubs? And I appreciate the difficulty with COVID that people can't, you've got to access them by a phone. And that in itself poses difficulties for people like my mum, who's pretty deaf, actually. It's difficult, but I suppose with COVID, that's what we face. But I wanted to know where geographically they were, because during my time as the MP, there were real difficulties in Lincoln accessing citizens' advice. And I suppose I was asking you, is there something in Lincoln now? I mean, Lincolnshire is a huge county, and 4 hubs. It's not a lot of hubs for a very big area. And this isn't something I'm addressing at officers. It's something that I'm addressing at politicians. So what I was asking you is where the names of the places where those hubs would be in normal times, because we haven't got restrictions at the moment. So where would those hubs be?
I understand your question in more detail. So for clarity, when I'm saying there's 4 citizens advice bureaus, what I'm not saying is there are 4 locations, single locations. What I'm saying is there are 4 citizen advice entities that provide advice across Lincolnshire. So there is a Lincoln one. There's also a South Lincolnshire provide advice in Grantham and in Stamford. There's a Gainsborough hub. There's also a hub in Louth and in Boston. And I believe there's a hub in Skegness as well that is available, as well as Sleaford, if I haven't mentioned Sleaford. So there's a number dotted around the county. Like I say, the operating model predominantly at the moment is that people are asked to access initially through the telephony system, which allows them to triage and balance that demand. And I know there's some questions around which hubs open and when. So I will bring you some further information, but they're typically around the market towns.
Thanks. That's helpful. Yeah, I suppose as well, my next question would be, are they open on a full-time basis? Are they easy for people to access? And is there a benchmarking system that would indicate whether the people who need help can actually get quickly to access that help, or if there's a wait for it, if there's a queue, or if they can only do it on certain days, that sort of thing, please. And I think I'll leave it then and let someone else speak.
Thank you. Okay, so in terms of the way they operate, there is a free telephone line that enables people to access advice. That is typically provided Monday to Friday, and we receive performance information from Citizens Advice that tell us how many of those calls they answer. And that is brought to this committee for scrutiny, and I think last time we did that was back in February or March, when the committee saw a report from them. In terms of the opening of each of those hubs, the opening times vary. So not all of them are open 5 days a week. Some of them have limited hours, but I can obtain and provide a summary to you that shows the opening hours of different locations. Clearly, what they try to do is provide as much advice as possible through the first point of contact and the telephony system, and triage to the most appropriate person. But I'll get Citizen Advice Lincolnshire to provide a list of current opening times for the benefit of the committee.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Key, followed by Councillor Clark.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was just going back to the consultation that was done between 18th of June and 9th of July. Obviously, that was just before the end of restrictions, and it probably explains why it was so difficult. It would have been nice perhaps to have delayed it until things could be done a bit more easily. I was also noticed that all the replies to that were electronic replies, and nobody actually replied in another format, even though they were offered. And maybe that's again because of the restrictions. We heard earlier how successful the hubs are, and maybe that would have been a good way to have consulted perhaps more widely, maybe especially with people who aren't able to do so electronically. And finally, on this strategy, I chair a village hall committee and a big group of volunteers, many dozens of volunteers. And I was thinking what they would have perhaps said if I'd given them this report. And to be honest, I don't think they would have probably said very much, because it probably would have been easier for them to comment if there'd been some specific examples, almost case studies of where these things, how they work, so that they could actually see how it would relate to their community. I think it is difficult for people to take in if they're not used to reading council reports. Thank you very much.
Okay, so in terms of the responses all being electronic, we offered to, as you highlighted, we offered alternative means for people to fill in surveys. Certainly during the pandemic, all of the survey activity has been done online, and that will have had an impact on demand and response levels as a result. What we're seeking to do through the strategy is to introduce a wider range of engagement methods that allow us to do kind of shorter polls and surveys that are slightly more interactive, the use of discussion boards, and also the ability to be able to provide different models of scenarios to people so that it becomes more interactive in the way that you've set out. Now, in terms of the community strategy, and as you will see from the action plan, some of the content of that strategy is to be developed with the community. So this isn't the county council kind of going out there and saying we've got all the answers to everything. What we need to be doing is working with community groups to understand the challenges that are faced, the provision that's in place, and then how and where we move forward together. So I completely take the points that have been raised, and that's within the thinking of the strategy. But as you've highlighted, the engagement was online due to the restrictions of the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Lee. Right, I can see community strategy is a bit of a live beast, and it's obviously going to be ongoing. I'm picking that up from you, Lee, that this is work that's ongoing and it's going to continue. But what I would like to see, and I pick up the point that Councillor Key made about case studies, that would be very interesting if we could see some case studies so that we can relate that back to our communities. But there are some communities, certainly within Lincolnshire, and I'm finding that out, that are very challenging and have few voluntary groups, very little support or limited support. And so I'd like to know, how are you engaging with challenging areas within Lincoln? And what are you going to do about it? Are you going to show it in this strategy? Are you going to try and include it within this work? Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of the activity around the community strategy is to identify needs that are being addressed and those that aren't, and then for us to work with others to plug gaps where appropriate. Now, sometimes that will mean that there isn't a solution already in place, as you've highlighted. Some of those communities may not be served at this point in time, and we'll be seeking to work with others to look at how that can be how that can be furnished in the future. So to give you an example, we're exploring some opportunities with a number of organisations at the moment about how we grow some additional community provision within more challenging areas. We're currently working both from a public health point of view and from a corporate and community strategy point of view to look at how we can develop a model that allows us to put in place solutions into different areas with kind of standard governance and standard terms and conditions, but allow us to build something that's stronger. And I'm happy to talk to you offline about the work that's there. In terms of in terms of case studies, part of what we want to do within the community strategy is be able to articulate better to you the work that's going on, but also the benefit of some of the activities that are taking place. So we want to be able to identify good practice and share good practice and promote that, and then look at how those things can be transferred across the county, recognising that there are very different needs in different parts of Lincolnshire, but looking at if we can identify things that are transferable and we can share that expertise, then we can move to a position where we get a better set of outcomes for our communities. So what I'm expecting is, as we do the mapping exercise to understand what's there, it will show us some quite clear gaps, and that will then work through with the groups that we're engaged with to understand how we fill them. Through the consultation, I think there are 18 organisations that came forward and said they wanted to work with us in the future on this. So we've got a good starting point in terms of those that were proactively coming to us saying they want to be involved. And equally through the pre-consultation engagement work that we did, there's a number of organisations that are kind of ready and waiting to help shape the community strategy and ensure that the focus is in the areas where the needs are greatest. So some of it is around simplifying things so that people can navigate themselves and access things that perhaps they wouldn't know were there already. And then some of it is about identifying those gaps and working out the best mechanism for filling them. But that will vary from subject matter to subject matter.
Okay, thank you, Lee. Councillor Brockway.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, it's about the statistics surrounding this. I've got a series of questions, really. They're short questions. On page 87, it talks about this as a targeted engagement. But I get the impression from reading on that the target audience didn't necessarily all respond. And I'm curious to know why this is. I mean, it's a targeted engagement. How many people did we actually want to engage? Did we only ask 39? If it was targeted that tightly. I understand what's been said about the background work and the background engagement, but did we only then ask for 39 separate people to respond, or did we ask more and only 39 respond? It's a little bit worrying, and the reason it's worrying is if you go on further in this report to page 94, it looks as though some of the questions have only been answered by as few as 4 people. And that's a considerably small sample on which to base anything in a population of 751,000. So I'm just worried about why. So let's ask the question first. Did you only ask for responses from 39 people? If not, how many did you ask for? Can we start with that one, please, Chairman? Thank you.
Okay, so no, we didn't only ask 39 people to respond. The consultation engagement exercise was promoted through social media. So that was seeking as many people as possible to come back and share their views. We also targeted a number of organisations that we felt would give us representative views and would want to be part of that engagement exercise. And then more recently, we promoted the consultation through the Town and Parish Council newsletter that's issued. So we were seeking to obtain views and opinion from as many places as possible. The subject matter isn't necessarily something that will appeal to everybody in the community. Not everybody wants to respond to this type of engagement work. And that is why, as part of the strategy activity, we're looking at how do we better tailor some of our engagement work to get a greater response and frame some of the information that we're asking for responses to a bit better in the future. But no, it was much wider than 39.
Chairman, can I come back with that? I need to go in a little bit more on that. If you've gone to that many people, we really need to look at why you've only had 39 responses. This is actually a really good engagement. There's good stuff in here. And when we've had engagements in the past, certainly we did a big one in 2016, we had thousands of people responding. For only 39 people to respond after you've done all that work, we need to know why. And so I really, Chairman, would like to take that much further, please. But can I just also raise, if you go further in this report, on the positive side, if you look at the equality impact assessment at the end, it really is one of the best I've seen. It's an excellent little document. And that document itself, obviously, you know, you don't always look at the equality impact assessment because it's there. It's something that has to be done. This is a really good one, and I don't know who did it, but they deserve to be complimented. And it's worth a read because it's informative in its own right. But 39 with only 4 responses on behalf of the entire county on the business aspect, we really need more. That needs to be dug into, please, Chairman. Thank you very much.
Couldn't agree more, Councillor Brockway. Councillor Clark, followed by Councillor Dunny.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Lee. I just want to come back to something that you identified when you were answering me before, Lee, about the gaps. Now, community strategy isn't new to Lincolnshire County Council, or indeed to any council, so you should already have some data about where gaps and where you're not communicating effectively already across the county. So I want to know if you're going to be using that, but also when you identify where these gaps are in service or in community engagement, please can you share that with us so that it's meaningful to us when we come back and we have your report on this. We can then take it further, we can look at it more, and then we can also try to identify issues within those gaps to help you. Thank you.
Yep. So in terms of using data that's already available, yes, we are using that. This document was developed across the organisation. So what we're doing is trying to pull it into a consistent narrative and understanding across the organisation, rather than perhaps having pockets of knowledge dotted around. We want to make it clearer what's there, what we already have, and how we make best use of it. So I've worked extensively with colleagues in adults, children's and public health, as well as working with the LRF on the content of the document to be able to start to understand what is already there. Some of it will be gaps in knowledge in terms of people not appreciating that there is already a provision that can be accessed, and that's part of what we need to map through. In terms of bringing things back, my expectation would be that we would be bringing updates on the community strategy back to this committee anyway. So I'm more than happy to bring in information about where we believe there are gaps and what we're doing about them. And I think that's something that through the improvements in engagement activity, we want to be able to better inform our policies. So when you start to consider policies in the future, you should have more representative engagement figures, and you should also be able to understand the activity that we're going to do next in a bit more detail. So I'll happily bring that back. Just going back to the themes of the engagement and the response rates, the businesses, the number, the 4 that was quoted in terms of businesses is showing that we had 4 businesses respond to the consultation, not that there were only 4 responses to a business question. It was when we segmented the types of response out, there were 4 businesses that responded. Now, clearly what we will seek to do is promote as widely as we can in the future to expand that reach. And we need to do that throughout the engagement work on an ongoing basis as we start to develop the actual content of the strategy in more detail.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Dunny.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question, but before that, I'll just start. As I'm a councillor from Boston, I do believe that Boston has around 30% of its residents, they come from Europe. And also, we have more than 32 nationalities, so I consider Boston as a cosmopolitan town. Now, there is an issue where we face a big problem, and I think it's not addressed at all sometimes, but we try to push for it in our borough, is integration. And my question is, what's our plans in Lincolnshire for a better integration, and what kind of engagement are we going to take forward to create that hub of communities where they can be living together, working together, and delivering together? If I may get an answer from Lee, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
So that's a useful example as to how we work in partnership with other organisations. So it isn't necessarily always going to be the county council that leads that activity. So, for example, work that is underway with YMCA has seen the introduction of a number of good neighbour schemes, and those good neighbour schemes recognise the kind of cosmopolitan nature of some of our communities and look at how we can build greater integration within those communities and cohesion within those communities through identifying shared purpose and identifying shared ambitions within the communities. So what we will do through that is seek to look at opportunities to grow and learn from those activities. We're also seeking to bring in additional funding to look at some system-wide changes that would enable us to test how we improve all aspects of the system to gain a better outcome for residents of Lincolnshire. So that's moving it away from being a single organisation view into recognising that we are part of a broader network and system that impacts on people's lives. This also starts to align with the work around the ICS and how we take a health view of the needs of local communities and how we integrate our services into that to some degree. So there's a range of activities there, and it's difficult to give you a very simplistic answer to it because there's all sorts of considerations that we need to take into account. Clearly, what we want to do is understand the needs of communities, understand the provision that's already in place to meet those needs, look at how we better promote and align activities in those areas, and then where there are gaps, we'll work with partners both in the statutory and third sector to be able to design, test and develop solutions that we hope will see the improvement. But I think the Good Neighbour scheme is a useful example as to on the ground kind of case study work that is going on now.
Yes, of course.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you give us an example of an activity which is taken and it's really gives some good results? Lee, thank you.
At a community level, some activity that's been based purely in a community. I think the Good Neighbour scheme is a key example of that. I think there are over 20 Good Neighbour schemes in place so far that have seen communities come together to start off with some very simple needs and requirements and then grow. So some of that was in response to the pandemic. We've clearly seen people doing everything from picking up prescriptions and collecting groceries, etc., and then that building into something that is more longer term. Now, clearly, what we need to understand is how we better connect the dots with some of those schemes to other things that are in place. So think about town and parish councils as an example and the role that they have within the development of the community, but also the role of elected members in terms of understanding the needs of the communities and being able to help us to convey key messages and develop solutions. So there's I think Good Neighbour scheme is probably a good example of it.
Okay, thank you. We've got Councillor Key, followed by Councillor Gray.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to keep going over things that have already been gone over, but I think my main concern that I would want to pass on to the executive would be the fact that this is the community strategy, and it would appear that the community haven't really got very engaged in developing it in terms of especially that consultation. So really it was just for some reassurance maybe that this isn't a one-off thing, and that consultation can continue to develop the strategy, because we've talked about it being a living document, and maybe that's the sort of thing that can be more easily done now that things are returning to normal. And I'd especially recommend that parish councils, if they were to be consulted first, they could pass on some of this consultation to the groups in their area. They know who all the voluntary groups are, and maybe that could encourage wider participation in developing strategies like this. So really it's just to say, hopefully this can be an ongoing consultation to develop it further. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good Neighbour Schemes has just been mentioned. I'm the lead for YMCA in the county on Good Neighbour Schemes, and we have just started a lot of work in Boston, and we've just launched a survey. We've been hearing about responses and the low response return rate, but you really have to do some detailed work in a community. We've just heard from Councillor Danny about the lots of different nationalities that live work in Boston, and we are finding it necessary to get the right feedback to look at the communities in much more detail. So for instance, that survey has gone out in Romanian, Bulgarian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Polish. We've now been asked for in Portuguese, because there is still quite a large community of Portuguese people in Boston. So really you have to make sure you do intensive local work and research to try and get that engagement at that grassroots level. We're working very closely, of course, with partners. So, of course, we've been hearing you have to work closely with partners, but it's all about that local engagement, that local knowledge to make sure you get to the root of the problem and the issue, and you get the right engagement.
Could I just add to that, Councillor Pepper, in terms of the previous points around the community, interacting with the community strategy and its development? I'd just like to reiterate that there was engagement prior to the formal process that we went through that's contained within the report. So we were engaging with representative groups to help develop the community strategy. What you'll also see through the document is that this isn't done at all, that the content and activities need to be developed with groups, with our communities and representatives. That will see ongoing engagement to develop the community strategy in more detail, and we expect to grow that as time moves ahead. And what this strategy is seeking to do is to make community engagement far more kind of key to our processes in the future. So it's something that you expect to see, something that you start to value and see as being truly representative. So we'll grow the kind of weight and the importance of it as we move ahead. And that's why when you read across into the customer strategy, where the customer strategy is starting to talk about how we co-design services and co-develop services, clearly we need strong engagement mechanisms to be able to do that in the future. So this doesn't stand alone, and it becomes part of how we do things. So I'd just like to provide that reassurance that this is a step in the journey rather than it being the end of the road.
Okay, Lee, thank you. As I said at the start, we've got a lot to get through today, so I'd like to move on if I can. But the actions for this committee is we're invited to support the recommendation that Executive approve and adopt the Community Strategy 2021 to 2024 in the form set out in Appendix A, pages 63 to 69. I'm going to move that the committee supports the proposed recommendation, along with the comments you've made, and if I'm reading the committee right, I think the lack of response is probably our major concern. So as long as all those comments have been captured, Katrina, I'll move to the vote. So I'm proposing...
Chair, can I just make a comment? Because
yeah, sure.
if you look in this report, the balance of negativity and positivity is actually, from the people that responded, was actually on the whole, I would say it was more negative than positive if you work your way through all of those. And the comments in this chamber this morning haven't been overwhelmingly positive. And I think when it goes to executive, I'd like to be quite sure that that is not watered down in any way, and that our concerns, I'm not going to vote in favour of this, I'm going to abstain because I'm not happy with this.
I feel that is mainly due to the lack of response, I feel it's due to the lack of response from the start,
I just want to make sure that when this goes to the executive, the scrutiny response is not watered down and that the strength of feeling in this chamber is actually passed on to the executive, please.
Got all that, Katrina? Yeah.
Councillor Lee, if I may reassure, all comments from today will be passed on to the executive exactly as they appeared in the discussion.
Okay. I've got Councillor Matthews at the back there,
Yes, I actually want to thank the committee for their questions and for their probing, because this is an area that has clearly emerged as something that's very, very important to community engagement. We're not complacent about it. I think Leeds presented an excellent report, but I want to thank the committee for their probing, because I think they're very good and valid questions.
Sure, thank you, Councillor. And this is scrutiny at its best, as I see it, I'd still like to move on if I can. So I'm moving that we go ahead with the report, including all those comments. And I still consider the overriding factor in this is the lack of response that's caused a bit of an issue here. So all those in favour, please raise your hand. Are we taking account? Those against?
I'd like to abstain because I'm just really unhappy with this. Thank you.
Understand, So none against. Abstentions, please. 2 abstentions. Sorry, that was Councillor Downey and Councillor Lee. Okay, thank you all very much. So scrutiny at its best, that is. Thank you. Item 7 then. Performance of the Library Services Contract, Year 5 Review Report. This item is on pages 115 to 136 of the agenda pack and considers current performance in the 5th year of the outsourced library contract to Greenwich Leisure Limited. The report will be presented by Louise Egan, who is the Library and Heritage Client Lead for Culture, and Nicola Rogers, who is the Lincolnshire Libraries Partnership Manager, who are attending today via Teams. So, over to you, Louise and Nicola.
Thank you very much, Chair. So as you can see on page 116 of the report, we have provided a breakdown in terms of the contracted service that we have across Lincolnshire for our library service. So that was commissioned out in April 2016 for an initial 5-year period. And we have just recently extended that for a further period of another 5 years, which will take us up to March 2026. In regards to the year 5 of the library service and the report that's detailed in front of you, this is mainly managing the COVID response that we had throughout the 2020 to 21 period. From March 2020 to the 13th of July, all of our sites did unfortunately have to close to members of the public, which did see our service move to an online engagement with our customers. So whilst we physically couldn't have customers within the buildings, it didn't mean to say that the service ceased. In fact, there was a lot of online engagement. We had over 103,000 social media interactions with our customers. We had over 3,500 new online joiners to the library service throughout last year. And to put that in context, we probably normally only have about 500 new online users. We have more than that in person, but from an online perspective, you can see there is a significant increase there. In terms of the interactions that we had with our customers during that closed period, we did see our e-interactions, so that was the books that were available online to our library members, increased by 249%. So it was a significant increase in terms of the interactions and issues that were being interacted with our customers on that online platform. And as a result, GLL, our commissioned library providers, did increase the service provision and the availability for those electronic items for our customers. We also ensured that we had support for those that were homeschooling children, so we increased the homeschool access through Britannia and other details that are included within the report there for you for your perusal. In terms of the rest of the year, from the 13th of July 2020 through to September, we were able to offer a click and collect service. So this was a pre-reserved service for our customers. So customers could either ring the CSC centre or they could go onto the online library management system, identify the sources and the material that they wanted reserving, and then attend their local core site to be able to attend those. Now, we did have customers who, for various reasons, were unable to make those reservations and did attend directly to the sites themselves. And the team did a great job in terms of being able to manage those ad hoc requests and also create grab bags so that customers could still have some provision whilst they hadn't been able to reserve the specific items themselves. During that period, we were lucky that we were able to offer the public network machines, so that's the customer public computers. We were able to make some access available to those because we identified that IT and the digital provision was a significant area of concern for many of our users across such a rural area where not everyone has unfortunately got either access to the internet and broadband in their own homes or equally don't have the devices themselves. So we wanted to make sure that we could still provide the computer access for those individuals to make sure that they weren't becoming either more socially isolated themselves or digitally excluded during the coronavirus pandemic. From July, we also enabled our mobile service. So that was the rural and the housebound community mobiles, which again meant that we could visit those customers who were in the outlying areas who unfortunately couldn't access the core sites in our main villages and towns across the county. As part of that, the mobiles team made sure that they were ringing up those vulnerable, really vulnerable customers that we have to make sure that they still were interacting and we could signpost to other areas, particularly within LCC, around the support that was available during COVID and in terms of being able to help, as mentioned previously in this meeting, in terms of picking up prescriptions and also kind of access to food for those that couldn't leave their houses, unfortunately. Luckily, from the 7th of September, we were able to offer browsing again within our sites. So that meant that customers could come back into the buildings themselves and be able to browse the shelves to be able to identify which stock they wanted to be able to loan. We received phenomenal feedback as soon as we were able to offer the browsing service again. And if you look from page 133 in your report, there is an appendix that highlights some of the feedback that we've received throughout this last year, highlighting just how vital the library service has been to many of our customers. Unfortunately, from the 5th of November right through to the 31st of March, we were unfortunately back in a click and collect position and varying degrees of whether we were able to offer that computer use to our customers. And that was a direct response to the tiered system that we were entered into and also the second and third lockdowns that we all experienced as a nation. I think I'll try and keep it brief for you, Chair, but what I want to highlight is, in spite of COVID, I think the desire for our customers to continue using this service was just highlighted at a phenomenal rate, to be honest. As soon as we were able to open those sites back up from July, so at least only half of the calendar year, we still experienced over 200,000 physical visits to our sites and over 3,000 COVID secure, socially distanced visits to home addresses to ensure that we could still interact with our customer and user base. It's worth highlighting that during this period there was no formal reporting in terms of performance for our contract provider of GLL, and that was because obviously this was a position that we've not experienced before, and unfortunately for the majority of the year we weren't able to offer the contracted service, so we didn't want then to be able to penalise our commission service provider as a result that was outside of their control. And I would like to highlight that was the case with many of our commission services across Lincolnshire County Council. Again, despite that, we did continue to receive that performance information, which is again included in the report in front of you. But we did receive some phenomenal achievements. So despite COVID and in spite of the difficulties with our colleagues in GLL travelling from the London area, we did still manage to finalise the IT transfer from Lincolnshire County Council over to Greenwich Leisure Limited. And again, this was just showing the paramount support that we had from customers in terms of accessing that digital engagement and now being able to utilise their own devices in the libraries and be able to print direct from their own devices rather than needing to wait and use the customer public networks that are available across our sites. Again, there's further information within the report, but we did still also manage to achieve some great engagement, particularly in terms of the Summer Reading Challenge, which is our main focus for the summer, and engaging our younger readers to still continue with that reading and development during the period where schools are no longer obviously in session. And that included things along the lines of Silly Squad, where we focused our online engagement to more of a younger audience and some of the silly interactions that we could have with them there. We still managed to organise author talks, and GLL gave out over 2,000 craft packs. So whilst we've been unable to have events and activities and story times, messy play, reading times in the sites, which we normally would do throughout the year, we still created craft packs so that parents could come and collect those for the children, so that they still had some level of engagement and activities to do, albeit within their own homes. And again, I think the feedback that we've received there is that that is something that customers would want us to continue doing, even though we have now reopened our sites. And as Will mentioned now, that many of the restrictions have been lifted as of last week, and that we are going to be focusing our attention during the summer and the coming months on physical activities returning to site. It is something that many of our customers still want to continue with. I think the other achievements that we'd just like to highlight are in terms of the reading agency and a programme that GLL was successful in achieving during this period, which was part of the befriending programme, where GLL received funding from the reading agency to be able to target and highlight those vulnerable customers that we've got within our database, and to be able to have weekly conversations with them, again to help support the social isolation issue that many of our residents have experienced during this pandemic and the challenging times that we've had this year. GLL were also successful in becoming an official support centre for the census. So this was for a 9-week period where customers could physically go into Lincoln Central Library and receive one-to-one support from our staff team there, to be able to help fill out the census itself and ensure that all the information was correctly received. And again, detailed within the report is the great feedback that we received from the census in terms of the advice and support that we've provided to many of our residents. I think the other area to highlight is what has been mentioned previously this morning in terms of our community hubs and the great network that we've got across all of the county. So we've got 34 community hubs alongside the 15 core libraries that GLL manage and support. And all bar one of those hubs are now reopened for browsing. And again, we've received some great feedback from our residents and our customers in terms of being able to utilise those as a local community hub and support network, where they also can obviously loan our library books and issues from. And I think it's probably just one area to pick up based on the last agenda item in terms of the community strategy, that we are able to use those library hubs as support networks to be able to highlight any of the consultations that we need to be doing. We currently have the Central Lincolnshire Local Plan documents available within some of our library sites to help with that engagement and that reach out to different community areas. And I think the Litter Heroes programme and initiative that we're currently working with alongside our community hubs just evidences where we can utilise these as assets to reach out to our wider reaching villages and remote areas. And I think, Chair, the last thing that I'd just like to highlight again is just that vital role that I think the library service has shown to our residents and communities over this challenging period and this last year, and that the interactions have still managed to continue in spite of the difficulties and the closure periods that we've obviously experienced. And what we're looking to do now in year 6, so that's from April of this year of 2021, is just continue to build on that COVID recovery. As I say, use the next couple of months to try and get events and activities back into sites, and build on customer confidence for them to be able to come back in and utilise the space that we've got available for them, the study rooms and homework classes and clubs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Louise. Any questions? Councillor Lee.
I'll try not to talk too much. It's a comment, actually. I've been in touch with Louise because as soon as I was elected, I had 3 or 4 people spoke to me verbally, and I had a gentleman who emailed me about library provision on the Ermine. The email actually was about digital stuff. He used the computers and the printers, and of course at the moment it does say in here that discussions are ongoing with a potential provider to take over management, and I do know this from Louise. She's been really helpful. But I would like to keep an eye on this because it's a service that is sadly missed within my division, and I would like it noted for the record, please, that I would like it brought back to the next committee meeting to find out if the Ermine Community Hub is indeed open by the time, because I know Louise has told me it's not going to be in 5 minutes. You know, there is a bit of a wait, but I'd like it to be monitored how long it does take, because it's a big community in Ermine and Cathedral, and they really, really miss this library service. And I would echo all of the points that Louise makes about the value of that to communities. So if this could come back to the next committee, please, just to update us if the Ermine Community Hub is indeed open by then. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
If I may, Chair, just to provide a little bit of detail to the rest of the committee members. Unfortunately, back in 2017, our library provider of the Ermine Community Hub did go into administration. And rather than see that asset, as Councillor Lee has just mentioned, close completely, Greenwich Leisure Limited were able to continue supporting that site so that we did still have provision within that area for those community users. Unfortunately, as a result of COVID and needing to utilise the resources that we had available to support the other community hubs that we had, and equally ensure that the core sites could continue to provide that provision in light of staff difficulties with isolation and clinically vulnerable staff members being unable to operate on the front line. GLL hadn't been able to reopen the Ermine site on the same time frame that some of the community hubs have done. Alongside that, we did think that this other provider would have been able to come in sooner to reopen that site, but equally, due to their own pressures because of COVID, we've not been able to make those final arrangements as of yet. We are still working with them in the hope that they will be able to open that site hopefully soon. But what I have promised to Councillor Lee is that if it looks like that there will be any further delays with being able to hand that site over to the new provider, we are in discussions with GLL about them being able to reopen the site temporarily again until the new provider can come in, because we are wanting to ensure that there is provision across the whole county. So I'm more than comfortable to bring that back to the next meeting, Chair.
Okay, Louise, thank you for that. I've got Councillor Corey wishes to speak.
Thank you, Chairman, and I thank Councillor Lee for her comment and note that and thank our officers for their response and working hard to try and get that, because you know that the library service is very important to us, and the presentation that Louise gave I won't go over again, but I think what we've heard today is an example of the brilliance and power and reach of local government in responding to this national emergency, and the way our officers and our colleagues at Greenwich Leisure turned the service around so quickly is wonderful testament to how we've been able to reach our existing customers and identify and serve so many new customers, many of whom we're working hard and creatively to retain. And like I said, this has been done through hard work and imagination to make sure that no one was left behind, or to try and ensure that no one suffered social isolation or rural isolation, or for children to be disadvantaged through living in a rural location because their families lack IT capabilities or cars to get them to libraries or hubs. So I want to thank everybody involved. It doesn't stop here. It's an ongoing process, and I'd be very happy to hear anyone else and any other questions on this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Any further questions? Okay. So thank you, Louise, for your report. The actions we have is this committee is invited to consider and comment on the performance information included in the report, and to consider and support the ongoing development and proposed Year 6 developments highlighted in the report, and also to highlight any additional priorities for consideration. So again, I move that we endorse the report and request our comments as recorded taken into account. Can you please raise your hands if you agree? All noted? Okay, thank you. As you know, we have no item 8, so we move on to item 9, the Coroner's Service Transformation Project. This item is on pages 137 to 140 of the agenda pack, and invites the committee to review and comment on the Coroner's Service Transformation Project. The report will be presented by Paul Smith, who is the acting senior coroner, who is attending today via Teams. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My role this morning is to present an overview of the Coroner's Service Transformation Project. That was the project which commenced in the summer of last year and was recently completed. By way of background, as you will see from page 137, it was a project put into being against the background of a merger between the coronial areas of Lincoln Central and Lincoln South back in 2017. The combination of those two areas was marked ultimately by the continuation largely of two ways of working, difficulties which continued following the introduction of a single IT package. Each office perhaps continued to operate the IT in a different way. And perhaps as a result of two different ways of working, mixed messages were sent out in relation to stakeholders as to what was expected of them. The overall business objective of the project was to create a higher performing service with more efficient processes, and ultimately with one eye to reduce costs wherever possible. As an ancillary aim, and there will be a second report by Di Coulson in relation to this, the project was to inform the business decision in relation to the possible merger with North and North East Links coronial areas. There were five project objectives outlined within the process, and I'll take those fairly simply if I may. The first of those was to identify a property solution for the coronial service. It's been a perennial issue for the coroner's service that we have not had our own dedicated courtroom, and we've been reliant on hiring facilities in as and when those are needed. The impact of the COVID pandemic in 2020 highlighted that, and as a consequence, the current facilities at Mile Cross were made available to my service. That it has provided a springboard for a long-term solution to the coronial home. I'm pleased to report that a temporary solution to enable me to hold jury inquests at Mile Cross has been considered and has been approved, and it is hoped that those jury inquests recommence at Mile Cross on the 18th of October this year. There remains a lot of work to be done, but I was at a meeting last week which seemed very, very positive. Building on from that, there are plans to use a different element of the Mile Cross complex to that which is currently in use to house the coroner service. And again, whilst that is awaiting final approval, I'm hopeful that that will follow fairly shortly. Interim technology was introduced earlier in the year. That allowed for virtual attendance at inquests. We were provided with the OWL system. It's a system which is not without some IT issues, and it's certainly a solution which is not always appropriate for each and every inquest, but certainly it is a solution which in the main has been workable. And when I say that only last week I conducted a 3-day hearing which was attended by members of the family from Australia, that gives an indication of the power of the solution if appropriately harnessed. Secondly, the project set out to define and implement county-wide processes, moving from a two office approach to a single office approach. That was embraced, and a single office system is to be put into place with effect from the 1st of August. That was delayed from July, simply to allow new members of staff to bed in before embarking on a new system of work. Ongoing work remains underway with the police. I have recently had a new Coroner Services Manager, David Stocking, appointed. He has, through his many years with the police service, a black book of many contacts. He has dived into that. He has spoken to the police. He has made contact with the new crime standards team, and there is to be now a new service level agreement between the Coroner Service and the police to drive forward a more collaborative approach. The project concentrated also on the effective use of the case management system, WPC, that both offices now operate. There were a number of quick wins, to coin an expression which occurred regularly during the process, in that the system could be configured to prevent the need for various information being double keyed into the system. Entries could be carried forward so that different fields in different documents self-populated. On the back of that, I was very keen to introduce a referral portal, which has now been implemented across GPs and hospitals, albeit on a trial basis currently. That standardises the criteria for referrals to the Coroner Service, and one hopes, as the medical professionals get used to dealing with it, it will also standardise the quality of referrals that we receive. A similar approach has been taken with the police service. There is a 5 forces form which is used across the East Midlands, with the exception of Lincolnshire. That will be done later on this summer, and again the benefits of that will mean improved standardisation, and there will be benefits also for business support. The absence of telephone referrals, for example, will prevent misunderstandings and prevent miscommunication, which may historically have been said to have been carried forward into referrals on occasion. That similar approach will be taken forward with the East Midlands Ambulance Service on a regional basis. We are exploring further technology solutions to push inquest information through onto the County Council website, which will take away the need for coronial cases to be inputted manually every time a case is listed. And last but not least, we have now sourced redaction software to ensure that the bundles we send out are GDPR compliant. The fourth aim was to identify value for money support contracts. That has been a key focus on the current round of procurement in relation to post-mortems. And the final 2 aims, if I can take them together, were to deliver the service requirements within budget and to review customer feedback and benchmarking. In relation to each of those, clearly it's early days. The budget did run within cost, and certainly the impression one gains from the early stages of the improvements made is that the improvements made have been beneficial and will be carried forward. By way of conclusion, you'll see at page 139 that whilst the project is now formally closed, it has started a process of continual improvement across the service. And certainly I can say that my team and my staff are energised and possessed of an appetite for change to continue to improve the service that we provide for the bereaved and their families across Lincolnshire. Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to take any questions arising from that if the committee have any.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Any questions? No, you got off light on that part, Paul. Okay, so the actions for this item are: the committee is invited to review the content of the report and comment on the transformation achieved and those areas highlighted for ongoing improvement. I'll move that we sorry, put my false teeth back in. Proposal. I'll move that we endorse the report and request our comments as recorded to be taken into account. Okay, so please raise your hand if you agree. All noted, Cara. Thank you. That takes us on nicely then to the next item, item 10.
Chair, can I request a comfort break soon, please? We've been going over 2 hours and even just 5 minutes, just to
Is that
the obvious.
Who of the committee? Yeah. Okay, so we can adjourn then and come back in 10 minutes if you wish. Yeah, yeah. Okay. 12:25. We've got everyone here who's back here, yeah, all feeling refreshed and whatever, yeah? Okay, we'll resume in that case then. So we've got to item 10, which is the proposed submission to the Chief Coroner for the merger of the Lincolnshire and Grimsby and North Lincolnshire coroners areas. This is a pre-decision item on a report regarding the proposed submission to the Chief Coroner for the merger of the Lincolnshire, Grimsby and North Lincolnshire coroners areas to one area to be named Greater Lincolnshire. This report was emailed to members of the committee on Thursday the 22nd of July, and the decision is being taken by the Executive Councillor, NHS Liaison, Community Engagement, Registration and Coroners on the 30th of July. That's Councillor Woolley, by the way. The report will be presented by Paul Smith, Acting Senior Coroner, and Diane Colson, Assistant Director Public Protection via Teams. The views of the committee will be reported to the Executive Councillor when she considers a decision on the 30th of July 2021. So over to you, Paul, and Diane, I believe.
Thank you, Chairman. I was planning to present, so I don't know whether Councillor Woolley wanted to say anything before I start.
Okay, Councillor Woolley.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Chairman. Just very quickly to the committee members. I want to emphasise that this is not something that Lincolnshire is being forced into. We do not have to put this proposal forward to the Chief Coroner, but it has come about because North and North East Lincolnshire have been advised that they are too small to continue in the way that they are doing. Having said that, I believe that there is a realistic opportunity for a Greater Lincolnshire grouping to actually provide some benefits overall for all residents in the county if they have to use this particular service. I am now going to hand over to Di, who I think is going to be principal speaker with Paul backing up as and when necessary. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Woolley.
Thank you very much. Okay, so as Councillor Woolley helpfully explained, the background to this proposal is that North and North East Lincolnshire have been told that they need to merge with a different coronial area. This is part and parcel of the Chief Coroner reducing the number of different coronial areas across the country. He is requesting that or he set the minimum of at least 3,000 referrals a year, which they do not achieve. So by combining North and North East Lincolnshire with Lincolnshire, that would get the referral rate to over 4,000, which is within the range that he's requiring. As Councillor Woolley has mentioned, there is no requirement for Lincolnshire to merge. On our own, we achieve over 3,000 referrals a year on average anyway. So this is not something that is being forced upon us. Now, it's important to say that this is a Chief Coroner decision. It's not a local authority decision. The coronial areas is a matter for the Chief Coroner. So effectively what we would be doing is supporting a business case to go to the Chief Coroner for him to consider and make a decision on. Now, we have been working with officers within North and North East Lincolnshire over the last year to develop a business case and a proposal which works for all of the local authorities and the communities of all of those local authorities. So in essence, the kind of the population split between Lincolnshire and North and North East Lincolnshire sits at around about 70 to 30 split. So these have all been factored in when we're looking at the proposal moving forward. So I'm not going to go into all of the detail that's within the business case and reports. I'm just going to give you a bit of a high-level summary. That way we can open up for discussion and questions. But some of the key points to note are that within the proposal, Lincolnshire County Council would be the lead authority, and the proposal is that we would 2P across the North and North East Lincolnshire staff to Lincolnshire County Council. And we would revise the service and have a single operating process so that, and also a single software programme so that the entire Greater Lincolnshire area would be working to one process and with one software system to achieve some greater efficiencies and provide a better and more effective service for the communities needed to access that service. One of the key things that's really important is that staff would still be based locally and inquests would be carried out locally, because we recognise that with a merger of this sort, some of the concerns might be that actually are we going to move all of the staff or all of the inquests to Lincolnshire or move them across to Grimsby or Scunthorpe. And that's not the case, because we recognise that actually local communities need those services within their local areas. So the proposal would be that the officers, whilst they would trooping across to Lincolnshire County Council for employment, they would still be based locally. And inquests would continue to be carried out as they are now in the local areas. So that service would be impacted to members of the community. So the other key point is that we want to make sure that none of the three authorities pay more than they do currently. Now, we've obviously done some detailed financial analysis at the moment. That work would need to be redone should the merger go ahead in the future, just to take into account any subsequent changes. But as things stand within Lincolnshire, we have substantially higher contract costs than North and North East Lincolnshire. So our contract costs sit at just over 1.4 million, and this is recognised by the service, and it's something that we're actively trying to work on to reduce those costs. And we currently have a tendering process ongoing in relation to post-mortem. And actually, we see there's a potential benefit in the merger in terms of being able to review those contract costs and look at services more widely, and hopefully reduce the costs of those contracts. So it would seem unfair to burden North and North East Lincolnshire with those significant costs when they don't have those currently. So what we are proposing in terms of the merger is to do a phased approach. So phase one, we would look at trooping across all of the staffing, so the coroners and the officers. As it stands currently, it's at a 77-23 split, so it's not too dissimilar to the population split, but there would need to be some levelling out of that as we moved forward. And within that first phase, again, we would retain our contracted services as they were for each of the areas, so people aren't impacted by disproportionate contract costs. Then in phase two, we would look to move to a per capita split for the staffing costs, and even that out, but we would make sure that the contracted services again remained as they were. And then phase three, we would look at splitting all of the staffing costs and the contracted services to that per capita split of 70-30. But that is once the contracted service has been fully reviewed and retendered, so that we've got a better and more cost-effective solution around our contracted services. So that's the proposal in terms of the phased approach. In terms of governance, the proposal would be that this would sit with the Joint Strategic Oversight Committee with an operational board with officers from all three authorities reporting into that joint committee. And that would also manage and agree the decision making around when we move from phase one to phase two to phase three, to make sure that all three authorities were comfortable with that, the movement of that. So in terms of moving forward, so this proposal has been to the Joint Committee last month, and all the leaders of the three authorities and chief executives have supported the proposal. However, as they're not a decision-making body, the agreement was that all three authorities would take the proposal back to their relevant committees or cabinet decision-making processes for a formal decision. So North East Lincolnshire's decision cabinet will be on the 11th of August. North Lincolnshire's cabinet was on the 12th of July, and they have approved the submission. So what really we want to do is to be able to submit to the Chief Coroner a jointly supported proposal for this merger. Now, we are aware that Hull have also submitted a bid to the Chief Coroner for a merger with North and North East Lincolnshire. And as I understand it, this has been done without consultation with North and North East Lincolnshire. And the Chief Coroner has agreed to stay his decision-making process until he's seen our submission as well. The merger between Lincolnshire and North East Lincolnshire would also fit in with the newly set out regional areas for the coroner service. So there is advantages to that. So I'm going to just pause there. That's a very brief high-level summary of the proposal, and then I'll just open it up to any particular questions or discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Diane. Any questions? Councillor Key.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've just got to comment on, I think it might be a typing error on page 8, actually, which confused me just briefly.
Is that where it says corners?
It's under what will the impact of the merger on associated services? And it says Lincolnshire has a good spread of providers, including Hull Royal Infirmary, whilst Grimsby and North Lincolnshire utilises smaller facilities at Lincoln County Hospital. I think that's probably the wrong way round.
Probably is. Diane, are you able to answer that one?
Yeah, unfortunately, Councillor, that's not the wrong way round. This is an anomaly that we do have.
That's why I was confused. Thank you. So it is the right way round.
It is, yes, unfortunately.
My question is to do with post-mortems. How will this affect post-mortems, do you think? Because I work in the funeral profession, and the deceased having to be moved around for post-mortems causes a lot of distress for families, and it can delay funerals as well. And I'm just wondering if, with this larger area, whether we'd be hoping to do the post-mortems more closer to where the person passed away. Thank you.
Diane, if I just add to that, presently post-mortems are carried out, I think, in Hull, Nottingham and Leicester for Lincolnshire. So just that's a supplementary to Councillor Key's question. Will they still carry on there, or will they all go to the other areas of Lincolnshire, Greater Lincolnshire?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Councillor. So, yeah, the point you highlight is one that we are acutely aware of. We recognise that it does cause distress for families to have their loved ones moved to different areas for the purposes of post-mortems. It is something that we have strived and worked hard to try and resolve. Our challenge being finding appropriate facilities locally with the appropriate pathologists to be able to carry out these post-mortems, which is why we've ended up in the situation that we have. And whilst North East Lincolnshire do use Hull, and that's something we can look at as well, and their usage of Lincoln. Lincoln, unfortunately, despite our best efforts, haven't been able to service our requirements. So there are some challenges there. But one of the things that we are looking at is the potential for a public mortuary. Now, that's in its very early stages, but the potential for that to be something local and to then take away this need to move deceased away from the area is something that we're trying to see if there's any future in that. But as I say, that is some way off, and that is a proposal that needs to be properly researched and worked through, but it is something we are actively looking at.
Thank you. Could I just come back? Because I remember when the services were moved out of the county, we were told in the previous job I had that it was sort of going to save money. But I can only imagine the costs involved in moving the deceased has been enormous since then. And I just wonder whether it has saved money or whether actually it would be no more expensive to do things back here in the county. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I haven't got the figures to hand to say whether it's more expensive or not. However, I can say that the costs around transferring deceased back and forward in and out of the county is one of our considerable contract costs. The issue about retaining it within county currently is challenging because we don't have sufficient facilities and sufficient pathologist availability within Lincoln to be able to do that within county. So we are forced to look elsewhere at the moment. But as I say, this is the purpose of looking at potentially of a public mortuary to try and resolve that situation in the medium to longer term.
Yes, thank you. I mean, just on a personal note, I'm sure it would be much more comforting for families. It will be, if we don't have to have all this moving people great distances after bereavement. Thank you.
So for clarity there, Diane, for the time being, will deceased still be took to, say, Leicester and Nottingham for post-mortems?
Yeah, so in the short term and probably the medium term, those contracts are in existence. We are retendering the post-mortem contracts, but in the short term, unfortunately, we don't have an option but to move them out for those services.
Okay. Any further questions? Diane, I noticed in the report that post-mortems are running at 38%. Do you know how that compares nationally?
Bear with me. As far as I'm aware, and Paul may be able to come in and assist me, but I believe that is around about the national average. I think we are on par.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's exactly in accordance with the national average.
Okay, thank you. And with it cutting across to police authorities, does that create any problems in itself?
So in terms of referrals, there will be set referral processes, and obviously the Coroner Service works very closely with policing in terms of those reports that come in. It will require homicide police to then report into two different authorities, but they're currently already reporting into North and North East Lincolnshire and Hull and East Riding. So there is already that challenge for those, but I don't see a particularly unwieldy challenge in terms of generating that relationship with homicide police and developing those processes moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Not too dissimilar. The police and crime commissioners, do they get consulted?
Yeah, so following on from the joint committee last month, we got agreement to start some informal consultation via letter, not wanting to predetermine the outcome. And part of that has been to write out to police forces and police and crime commissioners for any early observations or concerns. And so far, I haven't seen any concerns that have been reported back.
Okay, thank you. Can I just confirm with Councillor Stokes, Vice Chairman, with no more speakers, no more on chat? Okay. So the actions for this committee is we're invited to support the recommendation that Executive Councillor for NHS, Liaison, Community Engagement, Registration and Coroners, 1, approves on behalf of Lincolnshire County Council the submission of the business case attached to Appendix C to HM Chief Coroner for England and Wales, proposing the merger of the coronial areas of Lincolnshire and Grimsby and North Lincolnshire to create a single area known as Greater Lincolnshire. Also 2, approves the taking of such action as is necessary to support the legislative process for giving effect to the proposed merger on the basis set out in the business case. And thirdly, authorises the Executive Director, Resources in consultation with the Executive Councillor, NHS Liaison, Community Engagement, Registration and Coroners, to take all decisions and actions necessary to deliver the merger in accordance with the business case and relevant statutory instrument. So, as before, I will move that the committee supports the proposed recommendations and agrees to pass on our comments to the Executive Councillor. Do I have a seconder, please? Okay, so Councillor Stokes seconds. We will now vote. You are voting on whether you support the recommendation to the Executive Councillor and agree to pass on the committee's comments. All those in favour, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you. No one against? Anyone against? No abstentions? Okay, thank you. That is agreed. We'll now move on to item 11, proposals for scrutiny reviews. This item is on pages 141 to 148 of the agenda pack and considers the request made by the Overview and Scrutiny Management Board to identify potential topics for in-depth scrutiny reviews. The report will be presented by Cara to my left. Over to you, Cara.
Thank you, Chairman. On the 17th of June 2021, the Overview and Scrutiny Management Board agreed to request that each scrutiny committee identified potential topics for in-depth reviews to be undertaken by Scrutiny Panel A and Scrutiny Panel B. The Overview and Scrutiny Management Board will be considering these proposed topics in its formal meeting on the 30th of September 2021. Topics identified today will be evaluated through the prioritisation toolkit that can be found on Appendix A on pages 145 and 100 through to 147 of your agendas. At the time of writing up the report, there were no topics previously identified by this committee. Nevertheless, since the circulation of this agenda and report that has been included in there, I have received communication by Councillor Mrs. Nicola Clark, who proposed an in-depth review in the current picture of domestic abuse in Lincolnshire in light of the concurrent pandemic. Summarising, any topics in addition to the domestic abuse topic that I'm sure Councillor Mrs. Clark would like to and be happy to support will be discussed today and agreed to be proposed to the Overview and Scrutiny Management Board will form part of a report which I will be taking into the Overview and Scrutiny Management Board on the 30th of September. Thank you, Chairman.
Sorry. Okay, thank you. Councillor Clark, would you like to just enlarge on your proposal, on your thoughts? Do you have any more to say on that matter?
Yes, of course. My thoughts were around the reports that have been coming across, not just through Lincolnshire, but also right across the country, that this pandemic has caused all sorts of mayhem, but domestic abuse has increased considerably. And I think it's something that, because we've not had reports of it through while we've been going through this pandemic, everything seems to have been suppressed. People have been kept in their homes, and of course, I highlighted earlier this morning, it's not just domestic abuse towards women, it's domestic abuse towards men. It never gets reported, and I would like to see more in-depth reporting or some more information around that, but particularly to pick it up because of the pandemic. And there are so many areas within our work that because of the pandemic, we should be looking to get that data and put it into our systems, if you like, and to put it into our reporting so that we have covered it effectively during the period of the pandemic. We've gone out and actively sought that information to learn better lessons from what happens when things like this happen to the world. You know, so I think we have a duty to our residents to look at information, find data, report on it, and particularly where this has been quite dangerous. You know, there's been some dangerous reports, and it's highlighted it. So I would like to see more of an in-depth report on that. And just if I might take advantage of the fact that I've got the microphone, another suggestion did spring to mind, that this morning we were looking at the beast of, what did I call it? So let me put my glasses on so I can read it properly. Community engagement, community strategy. And I think actually that's something else that's maybe needs to be looked at by Scrutiny in more in depth to make sure that they're covering all the gaps that were being highlighted this morning. We don't want gaps in our strategies. We need to make sure that they're covered, and that the residents and the people of Lincolnshire are satisfied with the job that we're doing. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Clark. Councillor Lee.
Just to say, Councillor Clark, I had the very same thought earlier, and if Councillor Clark wants to propose that, I would absolutely second that. I think we do need to have a deeper dive into community engagement because it's clearly far from satisfactory, and that's not attaching blame to anyone. It's looking at a better way to go forward. Thank you.
Yeah, so we've got two items there we can send to over in Scrutiny. Councillor Key.
Could I agree with Councillor Lee too? I mean, it's the one thing we spent the most time this morning, I think, talking about was how we actually consult with the population of Lincolnshire over either new strategies or anything else for that matter. Are we doing it effectively, and are there better and different ways that we can do it? It's a bit of a broad-ranging subject, but it really did come to the fore as a new councillor myself. We spent a long time talking about it earlier, so I would definitely agree with both of my fellow councillors. Thank you. Okay.
Councillor Brockway, did you wish to speak?
Yeah, to support that, but also to add to it, I find it very worrying that we were faced with that this morning because several years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I got involved in the community engagement and the way it goes forward, and we found some stonking errors. For instance, I stopped one survey going out which actually stated that Lincolnshire County Council is responsible to see that everybody in Lincolnshire has enough money to live on. You know, and that's not what the person meant to say, but that's what they said. That's what was written. Sure. Yeah. And I think that what we saw this morning, all these years later, does require us to actually look in considerable depth at why we're still getting similar issues. So I'd be very strongly in supportive of these proposals. Thank you.
So, yeah,
The way
yeah,
we're
sure,
doing it.
yeah. So I've got two items there, both emanated from Councillor Clark. Do we want one of those to be looked at in preference to the other? So if we're faced to pick one out of the two, yeah, we can propose both, but I'm just thinking, should we be faced with, or will they decide which one to take? Do we want to emphasise one more than the other? Councillor Clark. We can hear. Okay, so we'll put them both forward with that one as the top one.
I think I'd add as well, actually, it's for us as a scrutiny committee to decide what we prioritise, not for anybody to tell us, actually. I think it's up to us what we think we want to scrutinise.
This is the very reason I'm saying which one do we want in preference to the other. Yeah, Councillor Danny.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do support Councillor Clark and Councillor Lee. It's very interesting that domestic abuse is sometimes undetected, especially towards men. But there is one small factor, and I think it's very important that we didn't touch on. There is an abuse towards children as well, which is very important. Sure. And why I'm saying that, because I talk from Boston and my experience, a lot of families, they use their kids for translations. They use them for different matters because they don't speak in English. So it's hard for them to communicate. They bring the kids to work. And I think we are depriving the kids or the children from their childhood because they get involved in family problems. And I think our scrutiny, and I mean, to engage with communities, we have to engage with families. We have to be close to families, and we have to know how we can sort out these problems, because for me, children are very important in a family, and I think they should have the right to do their things as children, concentrate on what they do on a daily basis in their schools instead of being involved, as I said, in family issues. And I think that one is very important for me because it's, it is, I think, happening, I think, all the time. Last year I was told by an officer from Boston that 5 kids, they were left at home and the parents were working. The oldest was 11 years old and the youngest was 1.5 years. And I think it's very important if we touch on that around Lincolnshire, and probably through a good communication and understanding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Danny. Councillor Key.
Yeah, could I just add to the previous comments about the community strategy? And it's obviously not for us to tell the panel how to do their job, but because we are talking about probably areas that we can improve our engagement, we really must urge them to speak to people from all walks of life. And that really backs up what Councillor Danny just said. You know, we don't want to be asking each other and just the officers. We want to be going and asking these people on the ground and these groups. We don't necessarily even just want to be talking to the representatives of groups. We want to be actually in the communities finding out what they think about the council and how we interact with them.
Exactly.
Thank
so.
you.
That made me think, when did we say it's 32 nationalities in Boston or something, you know, need to reach to all the full spectrum of people.
Yeah, could I just add as well, it's often the language we use and the not gobbledygook, but the council speak that means a lot probably to people here, but there was quite a few words in that report that I didn't really quite know what they meant. So if I didn't know, the chances are that lots of other people didn't either. So I think we've got a lot to learn in that area. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, so the actions of this committee, we're asked to consider whether to make any suggestions for in-depth scrutiny reviews. So we've come up with 2, reading the committee right, they're both equally as important, so I consider we ought to put them both forward. Okay. Did you want to come in there, Jackie? No. Okay. So my proposal is, based on today's discussion, I propose that the committee puts forward both of those topics. One is domestic abuse and the other one is the community strategy for the consideration by the Overview and Scrutiny Management Board on the 30th of September 2021. Okay, I'll propose that. Can I ask you to raise your hand if you're in agreement? Thank you, that's unanimous. Thank you. Moving on to item 12, Public Protection and Community Scrutiny Committee Work Programme. This item is on pages 149 to 154 of the agenda pack. The report will be presented by Cara, the Scrutiny Officer. Over to you again, Cara.
Thank you, Chairman. This item enables the committee to consider and comment on the content of its work programme for the coming year to ensure that scrutiny activity is focused where it can be of greatest benefit. I'm happy to report that with the exception of the Technical Response Unit report, refresh, from Fire and Rescue Service that will be now coming into the next meeting in September, going for executive, to be presented at the executive on the 5th of October. There have not been any other amendments or changes or additions or omissions indeed identified in this report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any comments on that? No. So, actions are the committee is invited to review the work programme and highlight any additional scrutiny activity which could be included for consideration of the work programme. We all seem comfortable with that. So, proposal, I'll move that we note the report and approve the existing work programme as detailed in pages 149 to 154. Can I ask that you raise your hand if you're in agreement, please? Thank you. Unanimously agreed. Thank you. Item 13. So we now sort of close as the Public Protection Committee and we reopen as the Crime and Disorder Scrutiny Committee. So it's item 13 on the agenda. It's update on the response to domestic abuse in Lincolnshire. This item is on pages 155 to 162 of the agenda pack and considers an update and overview of the work that has been undertaken in relation to domestic abuse within Lincolnshire. The report will be presented by Jade Sullivan, Community Safety Strategy Coordinator, Domestic Abuse Lead, who is attending via Teams. So hopefully you're there, Jade. Over to you. Having a comfort break. We believe she's muted. We're just trying to see if we can unmute her.
Chairman, while we're waiting, can I just make a comment, please, how much I appreciate the excellent IT work that we've had this morning. It's been absolutely on the ball, and for once, the voices and the images are in sync, which have meant I've been able to lip read throughout. It's made such a difference, and I think it's important to have praise where praise is due. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought the first presentation by Diane, I couldn't hear the first presentation by Diane Colson. I couldn't hear the first one particularly well. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So over to Diane.
Yeah, sorry, Chairman. It was just to update you that unfortunately Jade is having difficulties unmuting. She's going to just leave and try and join to see if that improves things.
Okay, we'll just give her a few minutes to see if we can achieve that. And I bet she's waited all this while.
Chairman. In light of the technical difficulties that Jade Sullivan is currently experiencing, can I propose that we defer this report to the next meeting, please, if the committee is in agreement? Thank you.
Can I just confirm there's nothing time critical in there at all? Nothing needs to be debated at this stage? It can wait, can it?
Happy to confirm that, Chairman.
Yeah, sure. Councillor Dunny.
Chairman, if you allow me, just because, let me see the paragraph. It says, for England and Wales, suggests 5.5% of adults aged 16 to 74 will have experienced domestic abuse in the last year ending March 2020. I would like to see if we can get any data according to people who doesn't wish to press charges.
Sure.
Because probably the problem is greater than what we have. 5% you say, oh, it's not probably much. But I think the issue here is bigger than that, because it gets washed. And I'm sorry to say that it gets washed by the police, and we don't know the correct and the accurate number. If we can get that, I will appreciate that, Mr. Chairman.
Okay,
thank you.
Chairman, if I may, Jade has rejoined the chat. Could we have another try?
We can, because we didn't entirely agree. It was close to it, close to deferring, but we didn't actually defer. So Jade, if you're there, over to you.
Hello. Apologies for that. I've been waiting all morning, as you said, Chairman, and then the technology failed, so apologies for that, and good afternoon, everybody. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Lovely, thank you. Right, I'm just going to reset where I was. Apologies again, I just need to find everything obviously kind of closed down. Thank you. Okay, so as you said, Chairman, my name is Jade Sullivan. I'm the Community Safety Strategy Coordinator with Domestic Abuse Lead for Lincolnshire County Council and the Domestic Abuse Partnership for Lincolnshire. The report that's been presented to you today is to give you an overview and an update on domestic abuse related activity in the last year. And obviously a lot of that has been throughout our COVID-19 pandemic, and also was the previous report that I reported on a year ago, very much focusing on the impact of that and how our services were operating. You'll see from some of the figures there that the crime survey for England and Wales suggests that 5.5% of adults aged between 16 and 74 will have experienced domestic abuse within the last year ending March 2020. So assuming that our prevalence is similar within Lincolnshire, which it is in terms of looking at our national figures against other figures, that roughly equates to about 30,200 adults aged between that age that would be suffering domestic abuse within Lincolnshire. And obviously, we've talked about children this morning, and the true number of victims of domestic abuse is also likely to be higher when we include children within that. And again, the crime survey for England and Wales figures suggest that 41% of partner abuse victims suffered abuse while their children were in the house, and that 21% of victims disclosed that children did see or hear what had happened. And that suggests that around 5,500 children witness domestic abuse in Lincolnshire every year within their own home. In terms of the last 5 years, on average, there have been over 10,000 domestic abuse incidences reported to Lincolnshire Police every year. Around about 6,000 of those are standard to medium risk incidences, and that is in terms of the national DASH risk assessment that is used across the country. And the proportion of higher risk incidences is appearing to fall, whereas the standard, like I say, the medium risk and standard is increasing. There were 930 victims who were at risk of high risk of serious harm or death referred into the MARAC Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference in 2020-21. Since the introduction of the statutory domestic homicide reviews in April 2011, there have been 18 cases involving 27 deaths that have met the criteria for domestic homicide review in Lincolnshire. I'll now go into a brief summary of the key activity over the last 12 months in terms of domestic abuse. And I'm sure most of you are aware of the Domestic Abuse Act that reached royal assent on the 29th of April and became statutory duty from the 1st of April 2021. And the guidance and draft regulations have now been published, and the consultation for those has closed today, with a contribution going in from Lincolnshire County Council and also from the Domestic Abuse Partnership. So there are a number of changes that the new Act does deliver. It delivers a legal definition of domestic abuse, which is the first in its kind, that recognises children as domestic abuse victims in their own right. It also introduces a domestic abuse commissioner to stand up for survivors and life-saving domestic abuse services, a legal duty on councils to fund support for survivors in safe accommodation, and that's the part that I will focus on slightly more in a little while. New protections in the family and civil courts for the survivors, including a ban on abusers from cross-examining their witnesses, and a guarantee that survivors can access special measures. New criminal offences, including post-separation, coercive control, non-fatal strangulation, and threats to disclose private sexual images. A ban on abusers using a defence of rough sex, and a guarantee that all survivors will be in priority need for housing and will keep a secure tenancy in social housing if they need to escape an abuser. A ban on GPs for charging for medical evidence of domestic abuse, including for legal aid, and a duty on the government to issue a code of practice on how data is shared between public services survivors report to and immigration enforcement. So all of these elements, obviously within that new DA Act, have an impact on the domestic abuse agenda and very much on the domestic abuse partnership. What we have been focusing on in Lincolnshire just for the last kind of 6 months around this area particularly, though, is Part 4 of the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, which places a 4-part statutory duty on Tier 1 local authorities to appoint a partnership that focuses and looks at the support and services for victims of domestic abuse and their children in safe accommodation. And there are several parts, obviously, to that. Like I say, there's 4 parts to that element. One is that we have to appoint a partnership that looks at that area of work. We have to undertake a needs assessment that looks at accommodation-based services within Lincolnshire. We have to then develop and publish a strategy, the first of which at the moment the deadline is for the end of October this year. However, that is still not been fully confirmed. We have to then give effect to that strategy through commissioning and decommissioning decisions through the local authority. And there is also monitoring and reporting requirements, of which in the draft guidance from MHCLG has been indicated that would be at least an annual report, and there looks like there will be some other monitoring elements in terms of raw data that they will be looking for. In terms of the partnership makeup, local partnership boards can vary across local areas, but in terms of our representation, you'd expect to see local authorities, victims and their children, domestic abuse charities or voluntary organisations, healthcare providers, the police and criminal justice agencies. And what I can say is that on our existing partnership, we already have a number and all of those people represented in terms of those agencies. What we are looking at, though, is our work around kind of engagement with survivors and their children actually being a part of that board rather than through our commission services seeking through case studies and surveys and information through that. And what we are looking at is having a shadow survivor board to support the work we do and to shape our services around this really important area. The types of accommodation that is included within the Act is refuge accommodation, specialist safe accommodation, dispersed accommodation, sanctuary schemes and move on or second stage accommodation. And within the MHCLG guidance that has been published recently, like I say, it's still a draft, there is a description of what each of those mean. And some of that we have gone back to them and we're asking for clarity on exactly what some of that wording actually means and what that will mean for local authorities, particularly Tier 2 local authorities within their duties around housing, and also around the sanctuary scheme and private rented properties. And also, as well as accommodation-based services and talking about what exactly that means within the Act, it also then talks about the level of support and types of support that they're expecting to see in terms of this new statutory duty. And that includes advocacy support, domestic abuse prevention advice, specialist support for victims with protected characteristics, children's support, including play therapy and child advocacy, housing-related support, providing housing-related advice and support, and counselling and therapy for both adults and children. What we do have in Lincolnshire is our Eden Links service, which is our outreach service commissioned by Lincolnshire County Council, and very much if you looked at that description there and then look at what they do and how they support people, very much through our outreach work and through our refuge service, that support is being provided. And since August 2018, we have had a dedicated support service as well to children of non-abusive parents that are experiencing and living in a household with domestic abuse. In terms of our response to the Domestic Abuse Act in Lincolnshire, you'll see from the report that we have been very busy, obviously trying to get ourselves ready for this. We did have a number of elements already in place. We've got a very good, as I said, outreach and IDVA service, independent domestic violence advisors within Lincolnshire that support our high-risk victims of domestic abuse. We have a very well-engaged MARAC, Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, which again deals with our high-risk victims of domestic abuse and brings our agencies together. Huge engagement in that process. We also had a very strong partnership that sat under the Safer Lincolnshire Partnership and engagement again from all agencies within Lincolnshire, particularly obviously the agencies that are frontline and have to deal with these instances on a day-to-day basis. What we have done so far in Lincolnshire to respond on top of what we already do to this new statutory duty is we've undertaken a full partnership consultation to look at our domestic abuse governance and resources and services within Lincolnshire. And that took place at kind of September last year. An implementation plan was developed and delivered to get us ready for April 2021. We've reviewed our commission services, including our outreach service, and looked at a number of elements there that needed some revision. And so we've gone ahead with some pilots to support that work. And we had a partnership conference that was held in March 2021 with about 80 people in attendance. And that was to set the scene around the domestic abuse bill. It was to talk about where we were in Lincolnshire and to gain support and momentum in the work that we needed to do going forward. We've also set up a district council and housing kind of provider forum, which is looking specifically at those things within the Domestic Abuse Act around accommodation-based services and the priority need element around homelessness applications if you are fleeing domestic abuse. The outcome of the partnership consultation was to change the governance of domestic abuse agenda, and that was to look at having a separate partnership within Lincolnshire, and that's what we've been doing since December last year. We've been transitioning from the Safer Lincolnshire Partnership to a separate domestic abuse partnership that sits alongside the other partnerships and is on equal footing with our Adult Safeguarding Board and Children's Safeguarding Partnership, and that was obviously a unanimous supported decision across that partnership. We have set up that partnership. We have a fully operating model in place with an operational and strategic delivery levels and with representation from all agencies in those areas. In terms of the allocated funding, I just wanted to draw your attention. We were allocated 1.4 million in Lincolnshire for domestic abuse for 2020-21. We will get an allocation for the next 2 years after that. We don't know the rate of what that allocation will be at this moment in time, but we are working with the LGA and MHCLG to find out as soon as we can what that will look like. But we are guaranteed funding as a separate pot of funding for the next 2 years after 2021. And then subsequently that will sit within the normal spending review money that gets allocated. Each district council were also allocated a separate amount of money, which was roughly around about £31,000 per district council. And the partnership is currently, in terms of the Domestic Abuse Act and the work that we've been doing, is currently undertaking one of the first parts that we are having to do, and which is our full needs assessment of domestic abuse within Lincolnshire, which is being supported by obviously ourselves, but also a company that we've commissioned to work with us and support us to do that. And that piece of work will then help us to develop our strategy for Lincolnshire, which, as I said, at the moment, our statutory duty is to publish that on the 31st of October and every 3 years thereafter. So as well as obviously the Domestic Abuse Act and the new elements around that, our other work has been continuing around domestic abuse within Lincolnshire, and particularly around our multi-agency risk assessment conference. A number of changes have been made over the last 12 months in order to improve and update its operating model, and to some extent, particularly to respond to COVID-19 and how we've had to work obviously within those circumstances. So now at the moment, and since kind of March, April last year, we have been operating virtually via Teams. There was lots of variations of that to start with, using conference calls, which was very difficult, but we are finally operating very effectively on Teams, and have been for a long time. We have looked at, though, then the impact of Teams and some of the added pressures that gives, and also time delays that it can give on big meetings like that when you've got about 25 people in the room, all having to contribute. So we have we split our MARAC meetings from 1 full day weekly meeting to 2 half-day weekly meetings, which has had a massive impact on staff wellbeing and also very much on the outcomes of those cases that are heard later on in the day. And in addition, we've piloted a scheme called MARAC Plus, which is about looking at how we better manage our repeat and complex cases that come back to MARAC on a number of occasions. What I can say is, whilst any repeat case we want to look at, we want to understand why it's coming back, we do compare ourselves against our other regional partners, and nationally, looking at our safe lives data that we report on, we are sitting around about 17% in terms of our repeat rate, and that is below the national average looking across those areas. But that doesn't mean that we obviously don't want to reduce that area of work, and that's very much why we were looking at MARAC Plus and other areas that we can support this piece of work. Excuse me. In terms of domestic homicide reviews, that has continued to be effectively managed within the last 12 months and through the COVID-19 pandemic. We have only had 1 domestic homicide review delayed due to capacity within our health agencies, and that was the advice and guidance given by the Home Office around at what stage domestic homicide reviews are at and when to halt and postpone due to the pandemic. However, that has since been picked back up and is fully underway and going through the due processes. Since April 2020 and to date, the partnership has commissioned 3 domestic homicide reviews, and 2 domestic homicide reviews have been published in the last 12 months. There's been a lot of communications and engagement activity surrounding domestic abuse, both locally and nationally, which we've obviously been supporting and or leading on, and the police have done a number of pieces of campaigns, again, which we through the partnership have been supporting. And we did produce a communications kind of plan and package, of which we followed last year. And we've also done a lot of engagement with businesses locally, particularly businesses that we knew were still accessible to people. We've worked with the local co-ops and Sainsbury's and pharmacies and other areas where we know that people were able to still visit particularly through lockdowns, and get some support and advice from those agencies. Excuse me, yeah. So there is also been a hidden harm summit where the government launched a code word scheme called Ask Annie. which has been disseminated out through the police forces in the country. And in Lincolnshire, there are 27 active pharmacies that have signed up to that scheme, and advice was also sent out to all pharmacies about that scheme and how they could support it through their area. There is another piece of work as well that is ongoing at the moment, and we are in the process of developing a communications and engagement strategy that doesn't just sit across domestic abuse, but sits across our safeguarding agendas, and looks at how we can collaborate those approaches to communications, avoid any duplication of work, and look at how being more sustainable within our campaigns and work that we do across those areas. So that's a piece of work that's ongoing. There's a number of also multi-agency training that has been developed in the last 12 months, particularly due to the fact we weren't able to do face-to-face training. So all of our training has now been converted to e-learning modules and workshops that are done via Teams and are working very, very well. But we do have a full training programme in place that sits in line with the DA Act. And is introducing a number of different areas of training for not just our agencies within Lincolnshire, but our communities and businesses as well. You'll also, I'm sure, be aware of the Make a Change community-based perpetrator programme. That has continued to operate in Lincolnshire over the last 12 months. It has obviously been affected by the pandemic and the way it's had to operate. But again, that has been happening via electronic ways, through telephone, through virtual meetings. And I know they've had some face-to-face meetings with individual people throughout that time where that's been necessary. And more now going back to group work where that can happen. So again, that is to work with individuals prior to them entering the criminal justice system, and it's about early intervention and supporting people that potentially don't even recognise that the behaviour they are showing is domestic abuse, and that they need support, obviously, to change that behaviour. In terms of our next steps and further developments, in the next 6 months, there is obviously lots of key elements that we need to focus on, particularly around the Domestic Abuse Act and areas of work around that. But we need to complete, obviously, our domestic abuse needs assessment, develop our new domestic abuse strategy and delivery plan. We need to continue to embed our new domestic abuse partnership arrangements within Lincolnshire, develop a monitoring and performance framework that sits alongside our domestic abuse strategy and our delivery plan, and very much tells us what the impact of the work we're doing around domestic abuse is. And we need to develop a mechanism by which survivors of domestic abuse can have direct input into the DA partnership and our service design within Lincolnshire. And that's one of our, again, key areas of work, and it's very much a feature within the Domestic Abuse Act, which is very much welcomed. In addition to this, we are still continuing to implement the findings of the MARAT review that was undertaken, and focusing on delivering a service that meets the needs of our high-risk victims of domestic abuse. But one of the other areas that we are looking at as a partnership, and is very much coming through our needs assessment, is around early intervention. And we've been looking at this for a while, and we do have a proposal put forward around how we look at our standard to medium risk dashes that are completed within Lincolnshire across our agencies, and how we support and bring those together earlier to identify domestic abuse at an earlier stage, and what support we can put in there. We've also been developing a very important piece of work around child to parent care abuse, and that is basically nearly at fruition, and a new kind of systems change approach will be introduced from the end of this year, with training and awareness raising training being put in place from September to start with for certain practitioners, and then that will be rolled out to the whole of the workforce for Lincolnshire. So just moving on to item 3 around the Domestic Abuse Commission services. You'll see from that, since 2018, we've had a single provider called Eden Links for our domestic abuse services within Lincolnshire, outreach and IDVA service, and also our outreach for children and young people. and we've also had a hospital IDVA-based service as well. Throughout the pandemic, that service has continued to operate effectively. We've had really high engagement and not had any issues with level of referrals in terms of being able to still speak to people and do the work that we've needed to do. We've had to be quite innovative about how that's happened, but it's worked really well. And actually with young people, we've found the engagement's been, in some cases, increased due to the fact we're using technology, and they've preferred that engagement in some cases. So that's something, there's some obviously lessons learnt from the pandemic and the situation we've had to find ourselves in, and what we'll take forward. The only thing that has been suspended or was suspended during the pandemic at one point was the hospital IDVA service, in terms of them being into the hospitals, and that's had to. They are now back in the hospitals and working effectively, but they were still there and supporting those hospital staff when needed. It's just that obviously due to, for their own risk factors, actually being in the hospital wasn't appropriate. You'll see there's some figures in there in terms of our domestic abuse outreach services, and you'll see that in the last quarter, January to March 2021, a total of 652 adult referrals were received into the service, and this is the highest quarterly volume seen during the contract to date. Up until that quarter, we had seen a slight increase in trajectory from March last year, but it wasn't any concerns in terms of the level of increase at that point. Sorry, I know I will. I've nearly finished. In terms of the domestic abuse related funding opportunities, just wanted to draw your attention to extra funding and further funding that we have secured in Lincolnshire, and particularly just draw your attention to the MOJ funding through the PCC's office that has been secured for 4 additional IDVA posts for 2 years, for a court IDVA, a rural IDVA, a further additional IDVA, and then a CHIDVA, which is children's IDVA, working alongside the outreach team and the children's workers within that team. So I really hope that, I know it's a really quick whistle tour of the work that's been undertaken, but I really hope that that's been informative. It's given you an overview of what's happened in the last 12 months, and that the work we've been doing around the Domestic Abuse Act and the new statutory duties is really just going to, our response in Lincolnshire and the DA agenda is going from strength to strength in that kind of area. And also just to say, obviously, the work that we've done from a Lincolnshire County Council point of view, but obviously as a whole partnership around COVID and how we've had to adapt and work and make sure that support has still been available. So thank you very much. If there's any questions, please.
Okay, Jade, thank you for that. Whilst you had the IT issue, we had a question from Councillor Danny. Would you mind asking that question again, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, I think we tend to ignore the child abuse. When we talk about domestic abuse, we always talk about probably from man towards a woman. But one of my colleagues here, Councillor Clark, has mentioned that man as well is submitted to the abuse. But we tend to forget about the kids in the houses because from my experience, the kids, they become translating issues to their parents. They translate for them home affairs, as I will call it. So have we taught about the children? Have we taught about their well-being and how we can conduct these issues? Just between brackets, as I stated here before, one of the officers in Boston, I think last year, I had a talk with him, and he stated that they found 5 kids in one house. The parents were at work, the eldest was 11, and the youngest was 1 year and a half, and they were by themselves in the house. So I would like this issue to be addressed properly, and I would like that we can get connected to the families and discover what's going on in the houses, and especially regarding the children. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I think in terms of domestic abuse support for children and young people, from August 2018, we have introduced a service specifically for children and young people within our outreach service that we commission. And that support is available, obviously, one-to-one for individuals within a family that has experienced domestic abuse. And as I said, that within the report, you'll see some figures around the numbers that we've supported within that service. But that has been there and it is being used, and I know that is obviously extremely important. And also, we've just commissioned, through the extra funding that we've received from the MOJ, the new for a two-year pilot at this point, but for a CHIDVA, which is a child's IDVA, to again support children experiencing domestic abuse within their own home. There is also in Lincolnshire what we call Operation Encompass, which is a police-led programme by which, if a police officer goes out to a domestic abuse incident, there is a report that is then received and sent through to the child's school, so that when they go to school the next day, they are able to be supported within school, and the school is aware of the incident and what they've experienced. So that is a really important piece of work that has been introduced in Lincolnshire. In terms of obviously the particular case, it's really difficult, obviously, when we talk about particular cases, unless you know the detail of that case. But obviously there is the Children's Services Customer Services Centre in terms of reporting concerns about child abuse and child neglect. And that very much obviously is part of our domestic abuse approach and services, that we don't work in a silo, we don't work on our own, and we would expect that through making that report through to that area of work, that children's services and our domestic abuse services would work together to support any case through the different levels of intervention.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Clark.
Well, man. Right, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Jane. That's an excellent report. And now then, yeah, I've got a lot of questions, but I don't want to hog the microphone because other people might want to ask something. What I want to know is, you've talked about the criteria of risks for victims of the victims. Can you tell me who decides when you become a victim of domestic abuse? Because no doubt when somebody's reporting this, they go straight to the police, and you've explained there are high risks, standard risks and medium risks. So can you just explain to me what the criteria is for those risks, and how easy is it for the victims to report what they feel is a crime, but what possibly the authority might not think is yet a crime? You know, how long is that process, and how do people of victims, how do the victims get their support? How long does it take? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, of course. It's really difficult because actually victims, there isn't just one route in terms of obviously deciding who is a victim of domestic abuse. That we, through our EDAN Links outreach service, obviously we do have an inquiries telephone number, we have a website, we have a chat function, and people are able to phone that at any point they need to, and either make a disclosure themselves in terms of a self-referral, or just ask a question, get some advice and get some support. There's also obviously national helplines which we direct people to and readily promote throughout Lincolnshire to make sure that there is that access. And there's that anonymity if people still want that, because that's obviously, as we all know, domestic abuse is very much still an underreported and difficult area, and very secret in terms of people and how they feel about it. So there's a number of ways, but so there's that self-referral element, but then there's also every single agency in Lincolnshire has domestic abuse training on the DASH risk assessment, which is the assessment that's used nationally across all agencies and police forces in Lincolnshire to assess the need and risk of a domestic abuse victim and someone suffering from domestic abuse. So those questions are very much gauged and around different elements of domestic abuse and those key indicators around domestic abuse, and that is meant to be go through with a person individually and explore their circumstances. It's not a quick process. It's something that takes a long time with an individual and a person that a professional and a person that is saying that they are experiencing domestic abuse. So nobody or no professional would ever say that, or shouldn't ever say that someone isn't a victim of domestic abuse. If somebody is saying that they are experiencing something, then that would be listened to and supported through that risk assessment process. I can obviously make that available to this committee in terms of the DASH risk assessment and all the questions that are on there. And we also have a stalking and harassment DASH as well, which we use and promote within our multi-agency training. And as I said, we have several levels and layers of training that is available to professionals and communities and volunteers across Lincolnshire and businesses as well. And we have been doing some quite specific work in businesses within Lincolnshire to equip them with that information as well, Councillor Clark. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Key.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question, really. If 5.5% of adults in the county suffered domestic abuse in a year, the chances are that some of our own staff have. And basically my question is, are we doing anything extra to raise awareness of this amongst our staff? I remember a few years ago, I was a contractor to a district council, and they had a really effective campaign with stickers in all the men's toilets, directly aimed at the men who may be suffering. And obviously I'm just wondering, we have an extra responsibility to our own staff. And is there anything that we're doing in this line for them? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Key. Yes, there is a number of things that we're doing. And I think that, so recently we've refreshed our policies within Lincolnshire County Council, and that has been directed and kind of led by our HR kind of colleagues, and that has also been sent out through email briefings. It's been delivered and spoken about within our other briefings that have been our kind of corporate briefings that have been delivered in person and virtually via Teams. We have also got mandatory training that we expect all of our managers and staff to undertake around domestic abuse to raise awareness, not just of the signs and symptoms, but the support that's available if you are experiencing domestic abuse yourself, and what support you should expect from your manager and your employer as well. We have done some work around that through the partnership. So all of our partnership agencies have also sent out briefings and policy document updates in the last year out to all of their staff as well. And what we are looking at doing as well is doing a newsletter across our 4 areas of safeguarding, Safe Lincolnshire Partnership, domestic abuse, the Safeguarding Adults Partnership, and the Safeguarding Adults Board, and the Safeguarding Children's Partnership, looking at doing something that is available to staff as well within Lincolnshire throughout our agencies. And we also then do specific pieces of work around domestic homicide reviews, and the learning that comes from that is very much disseminated through our agency, through Lincolnshire County Council, and through the partnership, with those key messages of things that obviously we've learnt from a domestic homicide review and a particular circumstance within that as well.
Thank you. Can I particularly recommend this sticker campaign to you, because
Yeah.
it got everybody talking in the building, and as people come back to the office, the toilet is often a place people take refuge if they're struggling, and it really worked. I'm sure it did. At least it got people talking about it, and especially the men. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Councillor. I think it's a really good idea. We have done it actually externally in supermarkets, funnily enough, and we've also done something similar when we were at Mile Cross with like you could pull off it's like had a tag on it, you could pull it off and it had the advice line on there and number that you could call. So I think that's a fantastic idea. Thank you.
Okay, any further speakers? Can I confirm with Councillor Stokes? No further speakers? Okay, thank you. So I'll move that we endorse the report and request that our comments are recorded and be took into account. Can I ask you to raise your hand in agreement, please? Thank you, that's all agreed. That now concludes the business of the meeting. Thank you everyone for your attendance and input, which is much appreciated, and apologies for the longer than usual meeting. Thank you.